She didn't scream when they tied her wrists. She didn't beg when her stepmother named her price. 20 silver coins counted out loud like feed grain at a market stall. Eleanor Voss stood in the summer dust of Colton Ridge and made herself a promise she would remember every face in that crowd. Every single one. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow Eleanor's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment below. Tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1883 came to Colton Ridge like a punishment. The heat arrived in June and never left. By July, the ground had cracked into 1,000 broken lines. The creek behind the Voss property had shrunk to a muddy thread, and the air smelled like hot iron, and something older, like patience running out. Eleanor Voss turned 23 that summer. She didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. Her father, Thomas Voss, had died 11 months earlier, a fever that took him in 4 days, fast and merciless. He'd been a decent man. Not rich, not powerful, but decent. He'd owned a small parcel of land on the eastern ridge, a modest house, 2 good horses, and a reputation for keeping his word that stretched across 3 counties. He'd also made one catastrophic mistake. He'd married Marguerite Delacroix 2 years before his death. Marguerite wasn't cruel in the obvious way. She didn't shout. She didn't throw things. She operated in the cold, quiet register of a woman who had decided very early in life that other people were obstacles to be moved around. She had a son, Philip, 19 years old, and soft in every way. His mother was hard, and she had plans, structured, patient, long-cultivated plans for the Voss land, the Voss name, and the Voss money. Eleanor had not been included in those plans. For the first year after her father's death, Eleanor had told herself she could endure it. She cooked. She cleaned. She managed the household accounts the way her father had taught her, tracking every cent with careful handwriting in a leather ledger. She stayed out of Marguerite's way. She smiled when she was supposed to smile and went quiet when she was supposed to go quiet. She thought if she kept herself small enough, invisible enough, Marguerite would leave her alone. She was wrong. It was a Tuesday morning when Marguerite came to her room. Eleanor was sitting at the small desk by the window, working on the household ledger. When the door opened without a knock, it was always without a knock, and Marguerite walked in wearing her best dress and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We need to talk about your situation," Marguerite said. Eleanor put down her pen. "My situation. The house. The land." Marguerite folded her hands in front of her. "Your father left things in a complicated state. I've spoken with Mr. Halverson at the bank, and he agrees the estate cannot support 2 households. There will need to be adjustments." "There is one household," Eleanor said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "This one." Marguerite's smile didn't waver. "Philip will be taking over management of the property. That's already been arranged. As for you..." She paused the way a judge pauses before sentencing. "I've found a solution." Eleanor looked at her. "What solution?" "Harold Finch needs a housekeeper. He's a stableman over at the Dunmore operation on the other side of the ridge. He's agreed to take you on." "Take me on," Eleanor repeated. "He'll provide room and board, in exchange for your..." Another pause. "Services." Eleanor stood up from the chair slowly. She was taller than Marguerite by 2 inches, and for the first time she let herself use that. "You're not selling me." Marguerite tilted her head. "I'm making an arrangement. There's a difference." "Tell me the difference." "The difference," Marguerite said calmly, "is that you have no legal standing in this estate. Your father's will has been filed. Mr. Halverson has confirmed it. You have nothing here, Eleanor, nothing that belongs to you. I'm offering you a way out that preserves your dignity." 20 coins, Eleanor said. She'd heard it from the kitchen hand the night before, overheard it really through the thin wall between the pantry and the sitting room where Marguerite had been speaking with Halverson. 20 silver coins. The price of a month's grain. "That's what you told him. 20 coins. For the first time something moved behind Marguerite's eyes. Not guilt, not shame, just recalculation. "That is a private transaction that does not concern you," she said. "I am the transaction," Eleanor said. They looked at each other across the small room. Outside, the summer heat pressed against the window like a hand on glass. "You leave tomorrow morning," Marguerite said. "I'd pack lightly." She didn't run that night. She considered it. She lay on the thin mattress in her room and stared at the ceiling and counted her options, the way her father had taught her to count carefully, without sentiment, looking at what was actually there, rather than what she wished was there. She had $12 hidden in the lining of her winter coat. She had a horse, or she'd had a horse until Marguerite had sold it in March without telling her, which Eleanor had discovered only when she'd gone to saddle the mare and found an empty stall. She had the clothes on her back and the clothes in her trunk and the ledger she'd been keeping for 11 months, which documented in precise handwriting every financial irregularity Marguerite had conducted since Thomas Voss's death. She took the ledger when she packed. She wasn't sure why. Insurance maybe. Evidence maybe. Or maybe just because it was the last thing that still felt like her father, his system, his handwriting in the first few pages, his careful accounting of a life lived within its means. She put it at the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in a cotton shirt. And then she lay back down and didn't sleep until almost dawn. They did it in the yard in front of the house. That was the part Eleanor hadn't expected. Not that it would happen, but that it would happen there in front of the house where she'd grown up, with the summer sun already hot at 8 in the morning, and 3 of Marguerite's acquaintances standing to one side watching, and Harold Finch standing to the other side, looking at the ground like a man doing something he knew was wrong, but had already decided to do. Harold Finch was 51 years old. He was not a violent man. He was not, Eleanor understood looking at him, even a particularly bad man. He was a small man, small in ambition, small in imagination, and Marguerite had found the precise combination of money and persuasion that had made him agree to this. He wouldn't meet her eyes. 20 coins, Marguerite said, and she counted them out from a small cloth purse into Harold Finch's palm, not the other way around. Marguerite paying Finch to take Eleanor, not Finch paying Marguerite for her, and Eleanor understood in that moment the particular genius of her stepmother's cruelty. It wasn't a sale. It was a disposal. The coins weren't payment for Eleanor's value. They were payment for someone's willingness to accept her. Eleanor stood straight. She kept her hands at her sides. She did not cry. Philip watched from the porch, arms crossed, his mother's calculations already settling into his face like a template. The 3 neighbors watched with the particular expression of people who have decided something is none of their business. And then, from the road from the direction of the Dunmore property, which lay 2 miles east over the ridge, there was the sound of hooves. He came in from the east out of the morning sun, and at first Eleanor could only see his silhouette, a large man on a large horse moving at an unhurried pace, as though the heat and the spectacle in the yard didn't concern him, any more than weather concerned a mountain. He pulled the horse up at the fence line and looked at the scene in the yard with an expression Eleanor couldn't immediately read. Not anger, not surprise, something quieter than both. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, though the sun and the mountains had written their own accounting on his face. Broad across the shoulders. His clothes were working clothes worn at the elbows, dusty at the boots, and he wore a hat pulled low enough that his eyes were in shadow. He had a scar along the left side of his jaw, old and white, the kind of scar that had its own story. He looked at Marguerite. He looked at Finch. He looked at Eleanor. "What's happening here?" he said. Not a question exactly, more like a man giving a situation the opportunity to explain itself before he made his own assessment. "Private business," Marguerite said. "You're welcome to move along." He didn't move along. He dismounted slowly, looped the reins over the fence post, and walked through the gate the way a man walks into a room he already owns. "Asked you a question," he said. "And I answered it," Marguerite said. "This is a family matter. Don't look like family to me." He stopped a few feet from Eleanor and looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes, she saw now, were gray, the specific gray of mountain stone, the kind that looks cold until the light hits it, and you realize it's been holding warmth the whole time. "You all right, miss?" Eleanor had been holding her composure for the better part of 12 hours. She'd held it through the night and through the packing and through standing in the yard while her stepmother counted out 20 coins to a man who couldn't meet her eyes. She'd held it through Philip watching from the porch with his arms crossed and the neighbors pretending not to see. She held it now. "I'm fine," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he looked at Finch. "Harold." Finch looked up. He'd gone several shades paler. "Mister, you want to tell me what you're doing here on a Tuesday morning with 20 coins in your hand and a woman standing next to you who looks like she'd rather be anywhere else on earth?" Finch opened his mouth, closed it. "Harold," the man said again, and his voice was the kind of quiet that made the air feel heavier. "It's an arrangement," Finch said. His voice cracked on the last word. "Mrs. Voss approached me with, 'It's an employment matter is all. The girl needs—'" "The girl," Eleanor said, "has a name." The man in the hat looked at her again. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the distant cousin of one. "What is it?" he asked. "Eleanor Voss." "Eleanor Voss." He said it like he was writing it down somewhere. Then he turned back to Finch. "Harold, I want you to give those coins back to Mrs. Voss." The yard went very still. "Excuse me," Marguerite said. "You heard me." He still wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Finch, and Finch was looking at the coins in his hand, like they'd turned into something he hadn't bargained for. "Harold, give them back. You don't have any authority here," Marguerite said. Her voice had sharpened. "You have no legal standing." "Don't need legal standing." He turned to look at her then, and whatever was in his face made Marguerite take a half step back that she immediately tried to disguise as a shift in weight. "I need a housekeeper. Miss Voss looks like she can cook. That's a fair arrangement. What you've got here isn't." Marguerite stared at him. "Who do you think you are?" "My name is James Calloway," he said. "I run the Calloway operation up on the North Ridge. You probably know it as the old Harker property." He paused. "The one with the federal survey markers along the eastern boundary." The name hit Marguerite like water. Eleanor watched it happen, watched the calculation in her stepmother's eyes shift, recalibrate, assess something entirely new. "The Calloway operation," Marguerite said carefully. "That's right." He looked at Finch again. Harold. Harold Finch put the 20 coins back in Marguerite's hand. Eleanor stood beside the horse while James Calloway retrieved his reins from the fence post. The morning sun was getting serious now, pressing down on everything without apology. "You don't have to come," he said, without looking at her. "I'll take you to town if you prefer. Put you up at the boarding house until you've got your feet under you." "What are your terms?" she said. He glanced at her sideways. "What? If I work for you?" "What are the terms?" He thought about it for a moment, which she respected. He wasn't a man who answered before he'd thought. "Fair wages. 20 cents a day to start. Your own room in the main house. 3 meals. Sundays off." Another pause. "I'm not an easy man to work for. The ranch is hard living, especially in summer. But I don't ask for anything I don't pay for." "Do you drink?" she said. He looked at her straight on. "Not in 3 years." She looked at him for a moment. She looked at the house where she'd grown up, where her father had taught her to read by the firelight, where Marguerite now stood watching from the yard with 20 coins in her closed fist and nothing in her face. She picked up her trunk. "I'll need to load this," she said. He took it from her. Not grabbing, not snatching, just reaching and taking it with the assumption that it was the reasonable thing to do, and tied it onto the back of the saddle with the practiced efficiency of a man who was accustomed to doing things himself. He helped her up. His hand was exactly where she needed it to be, and nowhere else. Then he mounted behind the saddle and turned the horse toward the North Ridge without another word to anyone in the yard. Eleanor didn't look back. She'd promised herself she wouldn't. The ride to the Calloway ranch took the better part of 2 hours. They went mostly in silence, which suited Eleanor fine. She'd spent the better part of the last 11 months surrounded by people who talked at her rather than to her, and the quiet had a texture to it that she found to her surprise restful. He spoke once about 20 minutes out. The ranch hands will have questions. About me. About why I showed up with a woman tied to my saddle luggage. I'm not tied to anything, she said. No, he said. That's why they'll have questions. She thought about that. What will you tell them? Truth, he said. That I hired a housekeeper. That's all they need to know. A pause. Ranch business stays on the ranch. What happened this morning doesn't leave this property. That's a standing rule. Who made that rule? I did? Why? He was quiet for a moment. Because the people who work for me have enough they're carrying without their past following them up the ridge. Another pause shorter. That applies to you too, Miss Voss, if you choose to take it. Eleanor looked out at the mountains. The Rockies in their summer austerity green, where the scrub pines had established themselves along the slopes, brown and gray everywhere else, vast and indifferent, and somehow cleaner for that indifference. Eleanor, she said. What? My name. You don't have to keep saying Miss Voss. He thought about this for a moment. All right, he said. Eleanor. Jai. The Calloway Ranch was nothing like what Eleanor had imagined during the 2 hours of riding. She'd been imagining she realized this only when she saw the reality, the kind of operation that a man with the name Calloway and federal survey markers on his land might have. Something impressive. Something that declared its own importance. What she found instead was a working ranch in the most fundamental sense functional spare, organized with a kind of brutal efficiency, that spoke of a man who had no patience for anything that didn't earn its keep. The main house was large, but unadorned, the kind of large that came from needing space for practical purposes, rather than from any desire to impress. The barn was bigger than the house and in better repair. There were 6 ranch hands in the yard when they rode in, and they stopped what they were doing and looked with the frank assessment of men who spent their days measuring practical things against practical needs. Boys, Calloway said, dismounting. This is Eleanor Voss. She's the new housekeeper. She'll be taking the east room in the main house. Show her the same courtesy you'd show anyone working on this ranch. Questions go through me. No one asked any questions. A few hats came off. A man named Dockery Foreman Eleanor would learn the kind of foreman who'd been with an outfit long enough to have opinions about everything, nodded to her in the particular way of a person reserving judgment. Yes, sir, Dockery said. Good. Calloway untied her trunk from the saddle. Miss Voss? Eleanor. A pause. Eleanor, I'll show you the east room. The east room was small and clean and looked out over the valley. There was a narrow bed, a washstand, a chest of drawers, and a hook on the door for her coat. It was the most privacy she'd had in 11 months. She put her trunk down and looked around. Then she looked at Calloway, who stood in the doorway. The kitchen, she said. Down the hall, through the main room left at the end. When do you normally eat? Breakfast before 6. The men eat in the bunkhouse. Martha Hendricks takes care of them. She's not well this summer, which is why the main house kitchen has been running light. Meaning you've been cooking for yourself. Meaning I've been not cooking for myself, he said, which is different. Eleanor looked at him. He looked almost uncomfortable with the admission, a large man briefly made small by the acknowledgement of something ordinary that he'd let fall to pieces. She understood for the first time something about why he'd stopped in the yard that morning, what he'd actually been looking for. Supper tonight, she said. What time? 7. I'll need to know what's in the larder. I'll have Dockery show you. She nodded. She looked at the room again. It was hers earned, not given, but hers. There was a difference, and she felt it. Mr. Calloway, she said. He paused in the doorway. Calloway's fine. Calloway. She hesitated for a moment, and then because she was her father's daughter, and her father had believed that debts should be named clearly, she said, Thank you, for this morning. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his expression. Not the recalculation that moved through Marguerite's, not the discomfort that moved through Finch's, but something older and less familiar. Something that had been sitting unused. "I didn't do anything particular," he said. "You did," she said. "I know the difference." He was quiet for a moment. Then he put on his hat, which he'd been holding in his hand since they'd come inside. "Larder's well stocked," he said. "Cook whatever you think is right. I'm not particular." He went down the hall. His boots were quiet for such a large man. Eleanor noticed that. The way he moved through his own house like a man being careful not to disturb something. She opened her trunk. She unpacked the cotton shirts, the 2 dresses, the winter coat with $12 sewn into the lining. She found the ledger at the bottom and held it for a moment before setting it on the chest of drawers. Her father's handwriting on the first page. His careful even script. Household accounts, January 1881. She ran her thumb over the writing. Then she closed the ledger, put it face down on the chest of drawers, and went to find the kitchen. The larder was indeed well stocked, better than she expected, better than any larder she'd seen since her father was alive. There were dried beans, flour, salt pork, cornmeal onions, 2 cuts of beef wrapped in cloth potatoes in a basket, and a row of canned goods that spoke of someone who planned ahead, even when he didn't plan meals. Dockery showed her around with the particular expression of a man who was assessing her as much as orienting her. He was somewhere in his 60s, wiry and weathered, with a white beard he didn't quite maintain, and eyes that had seen several decades of reading people. "You cook?" he asked. "I cook," she said. "Martha wasn't much with beef," he said. "Mr. Calloway prefers it plain." "How long has Martha been unwell?" "Better part of 6 weeks. She's got a sister in Cheyenne she's gone to stay with." He paused. "Main house has been on its own for 6 weeks, if you take my meaning." Eleanor looked at the kitchen. It was a working kitchen built for practicality. Good iron stove, good worktop, a sink with a hand pump, herbs hung to dry near the window. It was also, she could see, the kitchen of a man who had been subsisting, rather than eating, for the better part of 6 weeks. "I'll need a few things from town," she said. "Fresh eggs if any of the farms nearby have surplus. Some cream if it's available. I can make a run tomorrow morning." "Thank you." She turned to look at him directly. "Mr. Dockery, can I ask you something?" He waited. "How long have you worked for Calloway?" Dockery considered the question not whether to answer it, but how. 12 years, he said finally, since the beginning. Since the Harker property. His eyes sharpened slightly. "You know about that." "Only the name. He mentioned it." Dockery was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a man deciding what constitutes his employer's privacy versus what constitutes simple fact. "The Harker property was 9 years ago," he said finally. "Before that, Mr. Calloway ran cattle in Wyoming. Before that—" Another pause. "He was in the Army." "Officers," she guessed. Dockery looked at her with an expression she would over time learn to recognize as his version of impressed. "That's his to tell if he wants to," he said. "Fair enough," she said. She went to the stove and checked the flue. "Tell him supper will be at 7, and tell him to come hungry." Dockery almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." Said. She made beef stew because it was what the larder suggested and what the weather demanded, and because she understood with the instinct of someone who had fed people through difficult seasons that a man who hadn't been properly fed in 6 weeks needed something that would settle into him and stay. She used the salt pork for the base, the onions and potatoes to build it out, and she found in the back of the larder a jar of dried herbs, thyme, rosemary, something that might have been sage, that had been there long enough to be humble. She cooked for 2 hours while the summer sun moved across the sky and the ranch sounds came through the window. Horses' men's voices, the rhythmic percussion of work being done. Calloway came to the kitchen at 5 minutes to 7. He stopped in the doorway when the smell hit him. "Sit down," she said without turning around. She was ladling from the pot. He sat. She brought 2 bowls to the table. She'd decided without making a decision about it that she would eat with him rather than in her room, because she disliked the performance of invisibility, and because eating alone had its own dignity that she was unwilling to perform as subordination. He looked at the bowl. He looked at her. "Martha made soup," he said. "This isn't soup," she said. "Eat it." He ate it. She watched him, not rudely, but the way a craftsperson watches someone engage with their work, looking for the honest reaction that exists before a person decides what face to put on it. She watched the moment his expression shifted. Watched the particular stillness that came over a person when something good happens to them unexpectedly. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. He kept eating. He cleaned the bowl. He sat back. "You can cook," he said. "I told you I could." "People say things." "I don't," she said. She started on her own bowl. The stew was good. She had the self-assurance to know that the same way she had the self-assurance to know the accounts in the ledger were accurate because she'd done them correctly, and she knew it. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the empty bowl. "My wife used to cook," he said. He said it the way people say things that have been carried a long time, not easily, but not with particular difficulty either. Just the plain statement of a fact that has been lived with until it's manageable. Before she died, 9 years ago, Eleanor set down her spoon. "I'm sorry." "She was a good woman," he said. "Better cook than me by a considerable distance." A pause. "Better at most things." "Children. A son." Another pause. "He's in Colorado now, studying law." The slightest shift in his expression, not pride exactly, but the dignified older cousin of pride. "He's 21. Too young in my opinion, but lawyers generally are." "My father was a fair accountant," Eleanor said. "He kept excellent books. He taught me." She looked at the table. "Didn't keep him from making poor choices about people." "Rarely does," Calloway said. "No." She picked up her spoon again. "No, I suppose it doesn't." They finished supper. The evening came on gradually, as summer evenings do, reluctantly by degrees, the light going amber and then thin, and then finally giving up. From outside came the distant sound of someone in the bunkhouse playing a harmonica, badly with commitment. "You'll be wanting to know the house routine," Calloway said. "Tomorrow is fine," she said. "Tonight, I'd like to look over the household accounts if you have them." He looked at her. "The accounts. If there are any." She kept her voice neutral. "I like to understand what I'm working with." A pause. "Bottom drawer of the desk in the study. Off the main room." He stood up, picking up his bowl. "I'll get these." "Leave them," she said. "It's my kitchen." He set the bowl back down. He looked at her again with that expression she was beginning to identify, the one that existed before he decided what to do with whatever was happening to him. "Good night, Eleanor," he said. "Good night, Calloway," she said. He went down the hall. His boots were quiet again. She cleared the table and washed the bowls and thought about the desk in the study and the accounts in the bottom drawer and the ledger in her room at the bottom of her trunk. She thought about the particular patience required to wait for the right moment. She'd been learning it for 11 months. She thought she was getting better at it. She found the household accounts that night after the ranch had gone quiet. They were what she'd expected from a man who ran operations competently but without pleasure. Functional records organized well enough, but missing the detail that separated accounts from evidence. Money coming in from the cattle operations. Money going out in wages, supplies, equipment. A separate column for something labeled Ridge Survey Miscellaneous that appeared consistently over the last 3 years in amounts too regular to be miscellaneous. She sat with the lamp low and went through the ledger page by page. Then she took out her own ledger, her father's ledger with his handwriting in the first pages, and held them side by side. Ridge Survey. Miscellaneous. In her father's ledger, in Marguerite's handwriting from the last 8 months, Survey Fee Eastern Boundary. Same amounts, same dates, same blank bland description. Eleanor sat back, The night was quiet, except for the harmonica player in the bunkhouse who had given up on melody and was now just producing sounds that hoped for the best. She looked at the two ledgers. She thought about Marguerite standing in the yard with 20 coins in her closed fist. The way she'd said the Calloway operation after James Calloway had given his name, the way the calculation had moved behind her eyes. Federal survey markers along the eastern boundary. The land. It was always the land. Eleanor closed both ledgers carefully. She blew out the lamp. She sat in the dark for a moment with the summer heat still thick in the room despite the hour, and she let herself understand what she'd found and what it might mean. Then she went to bed because she was a practical woman, and practical women sleep when they can, because what comes next requires energy. And what was coming next, she was increasingly certain of it now, was going to require a great deal. She was up before 5. Not because the ranch required it. She didn't yet know what the ranch required, but because she'd been waking before 5 for 11 months, ever since Marguerite had made clear that the house ran on Marguerite's schedule, and the first person up set the fire, and the first person to set the fire was whoever was lowest. Eleanor had been lowest for 11 months. The habit had calcified. She built the fire in the kitchen stove, put water on to boil, and stood at the window with her hands wrapped around nothing while the ranch came awake around her. She could hear it, the slow stirring of the bunkhouse, the movement of horses. Dockery's voice in the yard giving directions in the particular tone of a man who gave the same directions every morning and expected them carried out without discussion. She thought about the ledgers. She'd laid the two of them side by side again before sleeping her father's with Marguerite's additions in the last 8 months, and Calloway's with its careful column of Ridge Survey miscellaneous, and she'd fallen asleep with the numbers running behind her eyes, like water finding its level. Same amounts, same dates. Someone was paying into a survey, or claiming to pay into one, from both properties simultaneously. The Voss eastern boundary and the Calloway eastern boundary shared a ridge. She knew that from her father's maps, the ones she'd studied as a girl, because her father believed that a person who understood their land understood themselves. The Eastern Ridge. She put cornmeal on for breakfast and tried to think about it plainly, without letting the anger she felt at the edges of the picture get into the center of it. Anger was useful. Anger at the wrong time and in the wrong direction was just noise. She was still thinking about it when Calloway came into the kitchen at 10 minutes to 6. He stopped when he saw the food already set out, biscuits from dough. She'd started the night before cornmeal porridge coffee that had been brewing for 20 minutes. He stood in the doorway for a moment with the expression of a man who has been ambushed by something decent. "You didn't have to start this early," he said. "I was up," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She poured coffee and set it in front of him, and then sat across from him and said without preamble, "Tell me about the Eastern Ridge Survey." He went still. Not dramatically, just the small particular stillness of a man who has been caught off guard and is deciding in real time what to do about it. "How do you know about the survey?" he said. "The household accounts, the column labeled miscellaneous." He looked at his coffee. "You went through my accounts. You told me to look at them," she said. "Bottom drawer of the study desk. Your words." "I meant for the household budget." "I know what you meant." She held his gaze. "I also know what I found. There's a survey charge that's been appearing in your accounts every month for 3 years. Same amount. Same description that says nothing." She paused. "My father's accounts have the same charge. Same amount. Same dates. Beginning 8 months ago, which is when Marguerite took over the bookkeeping." Calloway looked at her now. Really looked at her. "That's an interesting thing to notice," he said carefully. "I'm an interesting person," she said. A beat of silence. "The survey," he said finally, "is a federal land reassessment. The government sent a notice 3 years ago saying the original boundary markers on this property may have been placed incorrectly during the original homestead filing. There was a dispute with the neighboring property, the Harker claim, as it was then about where the eastern boundary actually sits." He paused. "It matters because there's water. A spring on the eastern ridge that feeds both properties. Whoever owns the ridge controls the spring. And whoever controls the spring, Eleanor said, controls this property. In a dry summer like this one. He looked at her steadily. Essentially, yes. And Marguerite's survey charges. She kept her voice even. You said the original dispute was with the Harker claim. The Harker family sold 8 years ago. The land changed hands twice before I bought it. He paused. The dispute was considered settled. The eastern boundary had been agreed on by both parties and filed with the county recorder. Another pause longer. 3 years ago, I got a notice saying the agreement had been contested. New survey ordered. By whom? Calloway was quiet. Calloway, she said. By whom? He looked at her with the expression of a man reassessing something at speed. The notice came from a land attorney in Cheyenne, a man named Gerald Halverson. The name landed on Eleanor like cold water. Halverson, she said. You know the name. He's the attorney who handled my father's estate. She said it slowly, feeling the shape of it. He told Marguerite the land couldn't support 2 households. He advised her on the... She stopped. He's the one who told her the estate filing was settled. Gerald Halverson, Calloway said, has been the land attorney for 4 separate property disputes along this ridge in the last 5 years. All 4 properties had boundary questions with the federal survey markers. He paused. 2 of those properties have since sold at prices significantly below value to a holding company based in Denver. Eleanor stared at him. You already know. I've been watching it for 2 years. Then why haven't you? Because watching and proving are different things, he said. And because the man I sent to Cheyenne to ask questions about the holding company came back with 2 broken fingers and a recommendation to mind his own affairs. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the ranch was fully awake now. She could hear the hands at morning work, the horses, the particular productive noise of a place that knew what it was for. You hired me yesterday, Eleanor said slowly, without knowing any of this about me. I hired you because what I saw in that yard was wrong, he said. That's the only reason I stopped. He looked at the table. But I won't pretend the coincidence isn't interesting. My father's ledger, she said. Marguerite's entries. If Halverson is charging both properties for a survey that controls the water rights, then someone is building a case to challenge the eastern boundary from both sides simultaneously, Calloway said, which would leave the spring in legal dispute, which would make both properties difficult to sell, difficult to farm, difficult to operate. He paused. Which would make them very cheap. Eleanor stood up. She went to the stove because she needed something to do with her hands. She refilled her own coffee and stood with her back to him for a moment, working through it. My father, she said. He died of a fever. I know. He was healthy. She turned around. He was 53 years old, and he'd never been sick a day that I could remember. And then he had a fever, and 4 days later, he was gone. She looked at Calloway directly. How many of the other 4 property owners along this ridge have died in the last 5 years? The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. 2, Calloway said. Eleanor set down her coffee cup. All right, she said. Eleanor, I said all right. Her voice was steady. She was her father's daughter, the father who had kept clean accounts, who had believed in the plain arithmetic of right and wrong. I need you to tell me everything you know. Not the parts you think I need. Everything. She looked at him. Because that ledger upstairs has 8 months of Marguerite's handwriting in it, and I've been carrying it since the day I packed my trunk, and I think I've been carrying it for a reason. Calloway looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up. Study, he said. I'll get the files. He had more than files. He had a full year of correspondence, letters to the county recorder, letters to the federal land office, 2 letters to a judge in Laramie that had never received responses, and a map he'd drawn himself of the eastern ridge with the disputed boundary markers annotated in red ink. He spread it on the study desk, and they stood side by side looking at it while the morning light moved across the paper. The original boundary, he said, pointing, runs here, filed in 1871. The spring sits 40 feet inside my property line. He moved his finger. The contested boundary Halverson's version runs here. The spring is in the disputed zone. Which means it belongs to no one until the federal survey is complete, Eleanor said. Which means it can't be used, bought, or sold until the federal survey is complete. He paused. The federal survey has been pending for 3 years. How long can it stay pending? As long as someone keeps filing procedural delays. He looked at her sideways. Which Halverson has done, twice. So you can't use the spring freely, you can't sell the property because the boundary is disputed, and every month you pay a survey fee that is... She stopped. Where does the fee go? Calloway said nothing. Calloway, the county recorder's office officially. A pause. I had a friend in Laramie look into it 8 months ago. The fee clears the county account and then transfers to a private account within 2 weeks. He couldn't trace it further without attracting attention he didn't think was safe to attract. Eleanor looked at this map. She thought about her father's ledger, the survey fee appearing month after month in Marguerite's careful handwriting, the amounts consistent, the description deliberately vague. She thought about Halverson telling Marguerite the estate couldn't support 2 households. She thought about 20 silver coins counted out in a yard on a Tuesday morning. She thought about her father dying of a fever in 4 days. I want to see the original county filing, she said. The 1871 boundary document. Why? Because if Halverson is challenging a boundary that was agreed and filed 30 years ago, he needs something to challenge it with. There has to be a document that contradicts the original filing. And if he manufactured that document... She looked up at him. I want to see what he manufactured. Calloway stared at her. That document is in the county recorder's office in Bitter Creek. I know. Bitter Creek is 20 miles from here. I can ride. Eleanor. He said her name with a kind of controlled steadiness, like a man measuring weight. The reason I haven't pushed harder on this is because the last person who pushed hard on it came back with 2 broken fingers. I heard you the first time, she said. I'm not suggesting we go looking for trouble. I'm suggesting we go looking for documents. She held his gaze. There is a difference, and I have a reason to be in Bitter Creek that has nothing to do with your land dispute. I'm new to this county. A woman setting up her affairs with the local recorder is unremarkable. You've been here 1 night, he said. I know. You don't owe me this. She looked at him directly. My father is dead, she said. His land is in the hands of a woman who sold me for 20 coins to protect whatever arrangement she has with Gerald Halverson. That makes this mine too. She paused. Unless you'd prefer to keep watching. The study went quiet. Outside Dockery called something to one of the hands. A horse moved in the yard. Calloway looked at the map. He looked at her. He looked at the map again. We go on Thursday, he said. When I have legitimate business in town. Supplies run. Nothing conspicuous. Thursday, she agreed. And you ride close, he said. If anything feels wrong, we leave. Agreed. He started to roll up the map. Then he stopped. The letters to the judge in Laramie, he said. The ones that never got responses. He looked at her. I have a copy of the original complaint, the one I filed 2 years ago. He paused. If you're the woman I think you might be, if you understand what you're looking at when you look at accounts, I'd like you to read it. Give it to me. He found it in the files, a folded document, 6 pages dense with the particular language of legal complaint, and handed it to her. She took it to the window and began to read. He watched her read it. He'd see later, when he thought back on this morning, the exact moment she found the thing he hadn't understood himself. The way her head came up slightly, and then lowered again, and then she turned to page 4 and read something twice. This name, she said. She pointed without looking up. Emmett Crane. Halverson's associate. He signed the survey challenge as a witness. Emmett Crane signed my father's amended estate documents, she said. The ones that excluded me from the property. She looked up. 2 weeks before my father died. The study went completely still. Calloway crossed the room in 3 steps and looked at what she was pointing to. He read it. He read it again. You're sure, he said. I watched Marguerite read those documents to me, Eleanor said. She held them up. I read the signature from across a room. Emmett Crane in blue ink, the E in Emmett written with a particular loop. She pointed at the page. Same signature, same loop. Calloway straightened up. He was quiet for a long moment. Eleanor, he said slowly, if Crane signed both documents, then the estate amendment and the survey challenge are coming from the same source, she said, which means my father's estate and your land dispute aren't separate problems. She folded the complaint carefully and handed it back. They're the same problem. The morning had gone fully bright by now. Calloway stood in the middle of his study with a piece of paper in his hand and the particular expression of a man who has just seen a structure he thought was familiar reveal an entirely different shape. How old are you? He said. Eleanor blinked. 23. You're certain about Crane's signature? I'm certain. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he went to the desk and began making notes. We'll need your father's estate documents, the amended ones with Crane's signature. I don't have them. Marguerite has them. Can you get them? Not without going back to the house. Then we need a copy from the county recorder, he said, which gives us another reason to go to Bitter Creek on Thursday. He paused writing. And we need the original estate filing, before Marguerite's amendments. That would be at the county courthouse, Eleanor said. In my father's name. Thomas Voss. Calloway wrote it down. Thomas Edward Voss. She paused. He filed everything under his full name. He was particular about it. Said a man who used his whole name was a man who stood behind what he signed. Calloway stopped writing for a moment. He didn't look up, but something changed in his posture, a slight adjustment, the kind that happens when something reaches a person and they're not ready for it to. He sounds like a good man, he said. He was, she said. He made poor choices about people, but he was a good man. Calloway finished his notes. He capped the pen and stood up and looked at her with the direct assessing gaze she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at things he respected. All right, he said. All right, she said. Breakfast is getting cold, he said. I told you to eat it when it was hot, she said. He almost smiled again. Almost. Noted. Tuesday passed and Wednesday passed and Eleanor learned the ranch. She learned it the way she had learned her father's land as a child, by walking it, by asking questions of anyone who would answer, by paying attention to the texture of how things worked, rather than just the surface of what they were. Dockery, who had been reserving judgment with the patience of a man who'd been wrong about people before and intended to be more careful in future, began answering her questions directly instead of obliquely on Tuesday afternoon. By Wednesday morning, he was bringing her information without being asked. The spring runs low in August, he told her on Wednesday, leaning against the kitchen doorframe while she worked on the noon meal. Last 2 years, it's been down to a trickle by mid-August. Mr. Calloway had to bring water in from the creek, which adds 2 hours to the hand's day. Because the spring is in dispute, Eleanor said, and using it at full capacity might be construed as a property rights claim. Dockery looked at her. That's a particular way to understand a water problem. It's the correct way, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Mr. Calloway's been carrying this for 2 years without letting it affect operations. That's not easy. No, she said. It isn't. He doesn't say much about it. I noticed. He doesn't say much about most things. Dockery paused. But he's been different the last 2 days. There's a difference between a man managing his problems and a man who thinks his problems might be manageable. Eleanor thought about that. She put it away to think about later because there were other things to think about now. She'd been going through Calloway's household accounts in the evenings with his knowledge and his explicit approval once they'd understood what they were looking for. She was building a parallel ledger, every survey fee, every miscellaneous charge, every amount that had flowed out of the Calloway accounts toward Halverson's manufactured process. 3 years of it. The numbers were in their way elegant, not large enough to be outrageous, not small enough to be ignorable. Exactly the size of the charge a man might pay for years without looking at too closely. She'd also been thinking about her father. He'd been healthy. He'd been 53. He'd been as far as Eleanor could account for it in the process of making trouble, asking questions about the survey. According to the one letter she found in his account. Notes, a letter he'd drafted, but apparently never sent to the county recorder. The draft was in the ledger tucked into the back pages in her father's handwriting. It asked 3 specific questions about the survey timeline and the authorization of the fees. He hadn't sent it. 3 weeks after the date on the draft letter, he'd had a fever. Eleanor sat with that knowledge every evening and let it be what it was, not proven, not provable, yet maybe never provable, and told herself that justice was not the same as certainty, and that the ledger was what she had, and she was going to use it. Thursday morning came with a change in the air, a slight drop in the heat that suggested the possibility of weather somewhere to the west, the mountains considering rain. Calloway had the wagon out front at 7. He was loading supply crates with 2 of the hands. Ordinary morning work. Nothing that would attract particular attention. Eleanor came out with her coat over her arm. The winter coat with $12 still sewn into the lining, and a canvas satchel that contained, among other things, her father's ledger wrapped in brown paper. "You're bringing the ledger," Calloway said, without looking up from a crate. "If we find what we're looking for at the recorder's office," she said, "I want to show it to someone official the same day, not take it home and bring it back." "Who do you have in mind? Is there a federal officer in Bitter Creek?" He straightened up, looked at her. "Deputy Marshal, Tom Aldridge. Do you know him? By reputation." "Good reputation. Good enough that Halverson hasn't managed to have him replaced." "Then Tom Aldridge," she said. Calloway looked at her for another moment. Then he went back to the crate. "Get up on the seat," he said. "We leave in 10 minutes." Bitter Creek was a 20-mile ride that took the better part of 3 hours on a wagon road that hadn't been graded since the previous decade. Eleanor sat on the bench beside Calloway and thought, and he drove and didn't talk much, which she was coming to understand was not unfriendliness, but the simple habit of a man who didn't spend words unnecessarily. About an hour out he spoke. "When we get to the recorder's office," he said, "you do the talking." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because you're looking for documents in your family's name," he said. "That's legitimate business. A woman managing her late father's estate. Nothing notable about it." A pause. "I'm a known quantity in Bitter Creek. Halverson knows I'm watching him. If I walk into the recorder's office asking for boundary documents, someone sends him a message before we're back in the wagon." He glanced at her. He doesn't know yet." "He will," she said. "Not today." He looked back at the road. "Today, you're Thomas Voss's daughter, settling her father's affairs. I'm the man who gave you a ride to town." She thought about it. "All right." "The recorder is a man named Simmons. He's not Halverson's man. He's just a man who does his job and doesn't ask questions that aren't his to ask. He won't make it difficult." "What am I asking for specifically?" "The original 1871 boundary filing for this property. It'll be under the Harker name, Original Homesteader, and the Thomas Voss estate filing, the original, not the amended version." "And the survey authorization," she said. "The document that initiated the federal reassessment 3 years ago. I want to see what it says and who signed the request." Calloway was quiet for a moment. "That's the one that might be difficult." "Why?" "Because if it was filed fraudulently, Halverson may have ensured the copy in the recorder's office is the version he wants people to see." "Then we look for inconsistencies," she said. "Paperweight, ink, color, the typeset. A man who forges documents in a hurry makes mistakes. A man who's been getting away with it for years gets lazy." She looked ahead at the road. "My father taught me how to read accounts. He also taught me how to read the documents behind the accounts." A beat. "He taught you a lot," Calloway said. "He taught me everything I needed. she said. I just didn't know until recently that I was going to need it. They rode in silence for a while. The mountains hung to the west, going gray at the upper edges where clouds were building. Eleanor thought about Thursday and what it might turn into by nightfall. Then she thought about something else. Calloway, she said. Your son, the one studying law in Colorado. He was quiet for a moment. What about him? Does he know what's happening with the property? A longer pause. I haven't wanted to pull him into it. He's studying law, she said. He's 21 and studying law. She kept her voice even. If what we find today is what I think we're going to find if Halverson forged the survey authorization, if Crane signed the estate amendment before my father died, if there's a holding company in Denver that's been swallowing properties on this ridge, you're going to need someone who knows what to do with the evidence. Someone who can take it to a federal judge without it being intercepted. She paused. A young lawyer with no established reputation in Wyoming is harder for Halverson to anticipate than a known operator. Calloway stared at the road. His name is Daniel, he said finally. Is he good? Another pause, the longest one yet. His professor wrote me last spring. Said Daniel had one of the sharpest legal minds he'd taught in 15 years. He said it the way he'd mentioned it before, not pride exactly. Something that had settled past pride into a quieter place. Said he had an instinct for where the truth was hiding in a document. Eleanor looked at him. He got that from somewhere. Calloway didn't say anything. Write to him, she said. Tell him what's happening. Tell him to come. Eleanor, you've been fighting this alone for 2 years, she said. That's why it hasn't moved. Halverson has the recorder's office, the county attorney, and 2 men willing to break fingers. You have a map and correspondence that nobody's answered. She paused. Let me help you build something he can't dismiss, and let your son do something with it. The wagon hit a rut, and they both steadied against it. The horses pulled through without complaint. He'll want to come, Calloway said quietly. I know. He's been asking to come for a year. I've been saying no. He was quiet for a moment. His mother would have told me I was being a stubborn fool. She sounds like she had good judgment, Eleanor said. He looked at the road. His jaw was set the way it got when he was feeling something he wasn't ready to say. Eleanor recognized the look because she'd seen it in her father sometimes, in the evenings after her mother had gone, that look of a man carrying more than he wanted to put down. Write to Daniel, she said more quietly. After today. He didn't answer right away. They came around a long bend in the road, and Bitter Creek appeared in the distance, the scattered shapes of buildings, the water tower, the particular flatness of a town that had been put where it was for practical reasons and had never developed aspirations beyond them. I'll think about it, Calloway said, which Eleanor was learning meant yes. The recorder's office was in the back of the county building, through a door that hadn't been painted in several years and a short hallway that smelled like old paper and ink. A man named Simmons looked up from a large desk when Eleanor came in. He was somewhere in his 50s, unremarkable in every way, with the comfortable neutrality of a person who handled other people's documents all day and had trained himself not to have opinions about them. Calloway waited outside. Eleanor introduced herself. Thomas Voss's daughter, settling her late father's affairs, terribly sorry to be a bother, and watched Simmons' expression do nothing more alarming than look mildly sympathetic and reach for his filing index. What did you need, Miss Voss? The original estate filing, she said, under Thomas Edward Voss, and if it's not too much trouble, I'd like to see the original homestead boundary filing for the Harker property on the North Ridge. I believe it's from 1871. My father had some correspondence about a boundary question, and I want to make sure I understand the situation before I proceed with anything. Simmons wrote it down. He went to the files. He was gone for 8 minutes, she counted, and came back with 2 folders and a smaller envelope. The Voss estate, he said, setting down the first folder. And the Harker boundary filing. He held up the envelope. There's also a survey authorization notice in the boundary file. Federal order 3 years back. You'll want to see that too, I expect, since the question is ongoing. Thank you, she said. May I have a moment to review them? Take your time, he said, and went back to his desk. She opened the Voss estate file first and found her father's original filing. His full name, his handwriting on the attached property description, the signature she'd known since childhood. Then she found the amendment, dated 6 weeks before his death. The signature at the bottom was Emmett Crane's, and the E in Emmett had the same particular loop she'd read from across a room in another county. She noted it. She moved on. The Harker boundary filing was genuine. She could see it immediately. The age of the paper, the particular fading of 1871 ink, the handwriting of a county recorder who'd been dead for 30 years. The boundary was exactly where Calloway had drawn it on his map. The spring was 40 feet inside the original property line. Then she opened the survey authorization notice. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time slowly. Then she sat very still for a moment, because what she was holding was either the most important piece of paper she'd ever touched, or the most dangerous one, and she wasn't entirely sure yet which it was going to turn out to be. She folded it carefully. She folded it with the Voss estate amendment and Crane's signature. She thanked Simmons, who looked up with the same mild neutrality he'd had throughout, and she walked back out through the hallway and into the afternoon where Calloway was waiting beside the wagon with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who has learned how to wait without letting the waiting show. He looked at her face. "What did you find?" he said. "The survey authorization," she said. "The document that started all of this. The federal order." "What about it?" She looked at him directly. "It was signed," she said, "by a federal land commissioner named Arthur Webb." She paused. "And below his signature, as the property agent who requested the survey, the name of the person who petitioned the federal government to initiate this whole process 3 years ago." She stopped. Calloway waited. "It's not Halverson," she said. "Halverson isn't the one running this." She held his gaze. "The petition was filed by a man named Roland Voss." The color went out of Calloway's face. "That's my uncle," Eleanor said. "My father's brother. A man my father hadn't spoken to in 12 years because of a land disagreement in Ohio." She kept her voice steady, because someone had to be steady. "He moved west 8 years ago. I didn't know where." She looked at the paper in her hand. "Now I do." The mountains to the west had gone dark with the promised weather. The first breath of it reached them there in the street, cool air off the high ridges carrying the smell of rain still an hour away. "He used Halverson," Eleanor said. "My uncle used Halverson and Crane and Marguerite, my father's widow, who he probably found specifically because she was willing." She stopped. "He knew my father. He knew how my father kept accounts, how he filed documents, what he'd fight and what he'd concede." Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "He built the whole thing from the inside out." Calloway reached over. He put his hand over hers, not taking the paper, not claiming anything, just his hand over hers for a moment, warm and still. "All right," he said quietly. "All right, Eleanor." She breathed. "Tom Aldridge," she said. "The deputy marshal. Where do we find him?" "2 streets over," Calloway said. "I'll take you." "Now," she said. "Now." He agreed. He didn't let go of her hand for another moment. She let him keep it. Then she straightened up, folded the documents into her satchel alongside her father's ledger, and walked with James Calloway toward the 2-street-away office of a deputy marshal who Halverson hadn't managed to replace while the weather came down off the mountains behind them, and the summer for the first time since June began to break. Tom Aldridge's office smelled like pipe tobacco and old leather and the particular staleness of a room where serious things got decided without enough windows. He was younger than Eleanor had expected, mid-30s, with a deputy marshal's badge that still had some shine left in it, and the eyes of a man who'd seen enough to know that most people who walked through his door were either lying or scared, or both. He looked at Eleanor and Calloway standing in his doorway and didn't reach for his coffee or his pipe. He just waited. "Mr. Aldridge," Calloway said. "Calloway." He nodded once, looked at Eleanor. Ma'am, this is Eleanor Voss, Calloway said. Thomas Voss's daughter from the Eastern property. Something moved in Aldridge's eyes, not surprise exactly, but recognition, the kind that had been waiting for something to arrive. Sit down, he said. Eleanor sat. She put the satchel on her lap and opened it and set the documents on his desk in the order she'd decided on during the 2-street walk, the survey authorization first, then the estate amendment with Crane's signature, then her father's ledger open to the page with Marguerite's survey fee entries, then the copy she'd made of Calloway's parallel entries in his own accounts. Aldridge looked at the stack. He picked up the survey authorization. He read it without expression. He set it down. He picked up the estate amendment. The office was quiet enough that Eleanor could hear the rain starting outside, the first real rain since June coming down off the mountains the way Calloway had said it would. Roland Voss, Aldridge said. My father's brother, Eleanor said. I believe he's been in Wyoming for the past 8 years. I don't have a current address. I do, Aldridge said. Eleanor looked at him. He runs a land brokerage in Cheyenne, Aldridge said. Goes by R.W. Voss and Associates. I've had his name on a list for 14 months. He set the estate amendment down with the particular care of a man handling something he'd been looking for. I just didn't have anything to attach it to. You have something now, Eleanor said. What I have, Aldridge said carefully, is a woman who found documents in a public recorder's office and a set of account ledgers that show parallel payments. He leaned back in his chair. That's suggestive. It isn't proof of fraud. It isn't proof of anything except that the same names keep appearing. Emmett Crane signed my father's estate amendment 6 weeks before my father died, Eleanor said. The same Emmett Crane who signed the survey challenge as a witness on your list. I heard you, Aldridge said. That's still 2 documents with the same name on them. A defense attorney would call it coincidence before you finished your sentence. The holding company in Denver, Calloway said. The 2 properties that sold below value. Can you trace the ownership? Aldridge looked at him steadily. I've been trying to trace it for 14 months, he said. Every time I get close, the paperwork roots through another layer. A pause. But here's what I know. The company is called Western Meridian Land Holdings. It's registered in Colorado. The registered agent is a man named Philip Delacroix. The name hit Eleanor like stepping off a ledge. Philip, she said. Marguerite's son. 19 years old, Aldridge said. Old enough to sign his name to a registration. Not old enough, I'd wager, to understand what he signed his name to. He looked at her directly. Miss Voss, your stepmother didn't engineer this. She was a piece of it. Your uncle built the architecture. Halverson executed it. Crane signed what needed signing. And Marguerite Delacroix was handed a ready-made opportunity to solve her own problems and walk away with a property she hadn't earned. Eleanor sat with that. She used her son as the registration agent, she said slowly, without telling him what he was registering. That's my read of it, Aldridge said. Which means if this comes apart, Philip Delacroix faces liability he probably doesn't know he has. He's 19, Eleanor said. Yes. She looked at the desk. She thought about Philip watching from the porch with his arms crossed, wearing his mother's calculations on his face like a template. She thought about a boy who'd grown up watching a woman operate and had learned to read her expressions as weather step back when the clouds came in, stay out of the rain. Not a good person. Not yet, maybe. But not the architect of this, either. What do you need, she said to Aldridge, to move on Roland Voss? A federal judge's order, he said, which requires a federal complaint, which requires evidence that rises above suggestive. He looked at the documents on his desk. What you've brought me today gets me closer than I was yesterday, but I need the connection between Roland Voss and the survey authorization, not just his name on the petition, but proof that the authorization itself was improperly obtained, that the federal land commissioner's signature, he tapped the survey document, was either forged or obtained under false pretenses. Arthur Webb, Eleanor said. The commissioner. He's in Cheyenne, Aldridge said. Retired 18 months ago. And before he retired, Aldridge looked at her. Before he retired, he approved 11 survey authorizations in this district over 5 years. 9 of them involved properties that subsequently had boundary disputes. 7 of those properties are currently in some stage of legal dispute or forced sale. He paused. Arthur Webb is either the most unlucky land commissioner in the territory's history, or he was very well paid to be helpful. Can you get to him? A deputy marshal showing up at a retired federal commissioner's door makes noise, Aldridge said. Halverson would know before I got back to Bitter Creek. He folded his hands on the desk. What I need is someone who can talk to Webb without making noise. Someone with a legitimate reason to ask about a specific authorization. Someone he hasn't been warned about. Eleanor and Calloway looked at each other. Daniel, Calloway said quietly. She nodded. She looked at Aldridge. Calloway has a son. He's 21, studying law in Colorado. She paused. He has no existing reputation in Wyoming. No connection to the property disputes. If he went to Webb as a law student doing research into federal land authorization procedures. A student, Aldridge said. Not an officer. Not a known party to any dispute. He was quiet for a moment. That might work. Write to him today, Eleanor said to Calloway. Calloway looked at her. He had the expression he got when something was happening faster than he'd planned for, and he was deciding whether to argue with the pace or match it. He matched it. I'll write tonight, he said. Aldridge gathered the documents carefully, making his own notes on a separate sheet. I'm going to make copies of these before you take them back, he said. The originals stay with you. I don't want them in this office where they can be accessed. If Halverson has eyes in the recorder's office, he may already know you were here today. He looked at Eleanor. Miss Voss, I need you to be careful. Your uncle doesn't know you yet, but he will. You're a variable he didn't account for. Good, Eleanor said. That's not a compliment, Aldridge said. That's a warning. I understand the difference, she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked at Calloway. Get her back to the ranch. Don't come back to Bitter Creek until you hear from me. He paused. And Calloway, that letter to your son, send it fast. The rain was real by the time they got back to the wagon. Not the tentative start of something, but the full commitment of a summer storm that had been building for weeks and had finally decided it was done waiting. Calloway pulled his coat from behind the seat and handed it to Eleanor without being asked. She put it on. They drove in the rain with the canvas stretched over the supply crates and the road going soft beneath the wheels, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Eleanor sat with the satchel on her lap and thought about Roland Voss. She hadn't seen her uncle since she was 11 years old. He'd come to Ohio for her grandfather's funeral, a tall man thin, with her father's eyes, but none of her father's warmth in them. She remembered sitting at the top of the stairs, listening to him and her father argue in the parlor below. The land it had been. Her grandfather's land in Ohio. Roland had wanted it sold and divided. Thomas had wanted to keep it in the family. They'd argued for 3 days, and then Roland had left and never come back, and her father had never mentioned him except once very briefly 2 years later, when Eleanor had asked. Some men measure everything they touch, her father had said. Your uncle measures land like other men measure money. He'll never have enough of it because it's not the land he wants, it's the measurement itself. The feeling of knowing it belongs to him. She'd been 13 when he said it. She hadn't entirely understood it. She understood it now. He came west, she said. Calloway looked at her sideways. Your uncle. He came west 8 years ago. My father said he left Ohio. I didn't know where he went. She watched the road, the rain making it dark and indistinct. He knew which properties to target because he knew how to read land surveys. He grew up reading them. Our grandfather owned surveying equipment, taught both of them. My father taught me. She paused. Roland knew how the federal authorization process worked because he'd watched it work his whole life. He knew which commissioners were susceptible because he'd been watching susceptible commissioners for 40 years. She stopped. He's been doing a version of this his whole life, just smaller. Ohio was too small. He scaled up, Calloway said. He found a territory where land was still being adjudicated, where boundaries were still being contested, where a man with enough patience and enough knowledge of federal process could manufacture disputes faster than anyone could untangle them. She was quiet for a moment. Andy found Halverson, who is good at the parts Roland isn't the local connections, the intimidation. The broken fingers, Calloway said flatly. Yes. The wagon moved through the rain. The mountains were invisible behind the weather, which made the world feel smaller, contained just the road and the wagon, and the two of them, and the weight of what they were carrying. My father wrote a letter he never sent, Eleanor said. I found it in his ledger. He was asking questions about the survey authorization. He would have found the same things I found eventually if he'd kept pulling on that thread. Calloway said nothing. He was watching the road. Calloway, I heard you. Say it out loud. A long pause. The rain on the canvas above them. Your father may have been killed for it, Calloway said. Yes, Eleanor said. She let it sit. She didn't cry. She'd done her crying privately in the east room of the ranch house in the 3 nights since she'd arrived when the ranch was quiet, and the weight of what she was carrying became briefly too heavy to carry upright. She'd cried for her father, for the good man who'd taught her to keep accounts and stand behind her name and trust people until they proved otherwise. She'd cried for the fact that trusting people had cost him everything. She was done crying. What came after crying if you were her father's daughter was work. He deserves better than what they gave him, she said. A fever with nobody to question it, and a widow who rewrote his estate before he was cold. He'll get better, Calloway said. It was quiet and definite the way he said it. She looked at him. He was watching the road, jaw set, hat low against the rain. He'd said it like a man making a promise rather than offering comfort, and she understood the difference, and it mattered. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said. Thank me when Halverson's in front of a judge. I'll thank you now and again then, she said. He almost smiled. The rain came down harder. Huai. They were a mile from the ranch when they saw the horse. It was tied to the fence post at the main gate, a good horse trail, dusty with Cheyenne livery markings on the saddle. Not one of Calloway's horses. Not a horse Eleanor recognized. Calloway's hands tightened on the reins. Stay on the wagon, he said quietly. Calloway, I mean it. He pulled the wagon through the gate and up to the house and stopped. Dockery came out of the barn at a half-run, which was not Dockery's natural pace, and that told Eleanor everything she needed to know about how unusual this was. Man showed up an hour ago, Dockery said low and fast, coming up to Calloway's side of the wagon. Says he's from the county attorney's office. Says he's got a notice about a property dispute. He paused. He asked about the girl. The girl. By name, Eleanor said. Dockery looked at her. Said he was looking for Eleanor Voss, daughter of the late Thomas Voss, in connection with the estate settlement. He paused. I told him I didn't know anyone by that name. He's still here, Calloway said. Inside. I put him in the front room because I didn't think I could send him off without making something of it. Calloway was down from the wagon before Dockery finished the sentence. He turned and offered his hand to Eleanor, and she took it and got down, and he said quietly, without letting go of her hand, You don't have to be Eleanor Voss right now. I know, she said, but I should be. He looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. Stay behind me until I get a read on him. She didn't argue. She'd pick her moment. The man in the front room was 50 years old, soft in the way of a man who did his work with paper rather than his hands, and he had the particular expression of someone who had been kept waiting longer than he expected and was composing his displeasure into a formal shape. He stood up when Calloway came in. "Mr. Calloway," he said. "My name is Foster. I'm with the county attorney's office. I'm looking for a Miss Eleanor Voss, daughter of—" "I'm here," Eleanor said from behind Calloway's shoulder. Foster looked at her. She watched him recalibrate. He'd been expecting something easier, she thought. A frightened woman, maybe. Someone who'd been in the county 3 days and didn't know the terrain. "Miss Voss," he said. "I have a notice regarding the Thomas Voss estate. There's a question about a ledger that is believed to be part of the estate's property, specifically household accounts kept during the last year of Mr. Voss's life." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "Mrs. Marguerite Voss has filed a claim that certain property belonging to the estate was removed without authorization. She's requesting its return." Eleanor looked at the document without taking it. "My father's ledger," she said, "among other items." "I kept those accounts," Eleanor said. "Every entry from January of this year through my father's death is in my handwriting. I'd be happy to demonstrate that to any judge who'd like to see it." "That's a matter for the estate court to determine," Foster said carefully. "What estate court?" Calloway said. "The estate was settled by Mr. Halverson. Mrs. Voss has already claimed the property." "There's been a supplemental filing," Foster said. He had the tone of a man reading from a script he hadn't written. "Certain items were apparently overlooked in the original settlement." "Certain items," Eleanor said. "Like the household accounts that document 8 months of payments to a survey operation that's currently under federal review." Foster blinked. Just once, but it was enough. "I'm not aware of any federal review," he said. "You will be," Eleanor said. The room was very quiet. Foster looked from her to Calloway and back, and Eleanor watched him doing the arithmetic, what he'd been told to expect, versus what was actually in front of him, and she watched the arithmetic come out somewhere uncomfortable. "Miss Voss," he said more carefully now, "I'm simply here to serve the notice. I have no position on the underlying matter." "Of course," Eleanor said. She took the document from him. "You've served it. Thank you for making the ride out." She looked at him directly. "Is there anything else?" A pause. "No," he said. "Dockery will see you out," Calloway said. Dockery materialized from the hallway with the precision of a man who had been listening from 6 feet away and had timed his entrance perfectly. Foster gathered his hat and coat and went with Dockery, and the front room was quiet. Eleanor looked at the notice in her hands. She read it. It was exactly what Foster had described: a supplemental estate claim filed 2 days ago citing the household ledger as estate property, signed by Halverson. "2 days ago," she said. "I've been here 4 days." "He moved fast," Calloway said. "He knew I took the ledger when I left," she said. "Marguerite told him." She looked up. "Which means they knew within hours that I was gone and what I might have. Which means they're scared of what you might do with it." "They should be," she said. She folded the notice and put it in the satchel with the documents from Bitter Creek. She sat down on the chair nearest the door, not because she was tired, but because her legs had made the decision before her mind caught up, and she'd learned to respect her body's accounting of things. Calloway sat across from her. He didn't ask if she was all right. She liked that about him. "We need to move faster than I planned," she said. "I know." "The letter to Daniel. I'll write it tonight and send it with the morning rider," he said. "It'll reach Colorado City in 4 days if the weather holds." "Aldridge needs to know about the notice," she said. "It means Halverson is aware I'm here, which means he'll start looking for the connection between my being here and what I found in the recorder's office." "I'll send Dockery to Bitter Creek tomorrow," Calloway said, "with a message." Eleanor nodded. She pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed. "There's something else," she said. "What?" "Foster said the notice was about items overlooked in the original settlement." She looked at him. "That's a legal position, not just a recovery claim. If Halverson is taking this to a state court, he's going to argue that everything I took when I left, including my own clothing, my winter coat, the $12 in my lining, belongs to the Voss estate. He can't. He can try," she said. "And in front of the wrong judge with the wrong county attorney, he might get somewhere." She paused. It's not about the ledger. He knows I've read it. He knows I know what's in it. The estate claim is a mechanism to get me into a county courtroom on his terms with his judge before I can get to a federal proceeding." Calloway was quiet for a moment. She could see him thinking, not rushing it, moving through it the way he moved through his own house carefully without disturbing things. "Then we don't go to county court," he said. "We go to federal first. Aldridge can file a federal complaint based on what we brought him today," she said. "But it takes time, and in the meantime, you're staying on this ranch," Calloway said. "And nobody walks onto this property without my say-so." There was something in how he said it, not a threat exactly, but the quiet finality of a man marking a line. Eleanor looked at him. "Calloway," she said slowly, "how much do you know about Halverson's men, the ones who broke your messenger's fingers?" He held her gaze. "2 of them are in Bitter Creek. 1 is in Cheyenne." A pause. "Why?" "Because Foster came out here alone," she said. "On a county attorney's errand with a civil notice. That's the polite version of what happens next." She kept her voice even. "There's an impolite version." "I know that," he said. "Do you have enough hands if—" "Yes," he said. Simple and flat. She looked at him. He looked back at her. There was a long beat of something between them, not comfortable exactly, but the specific kind of solid that gets built between 2 people who have decided without announcing it that they're facing the same direction. "All right," she said. She stood up. She had supper to start, and a letter to help Calloway write, and a list of contingencies to work through in the back of her mind while her hands did other things. She was halfway to the door when he spoke. "Eleanor." She stopped. "What you did in there," he said. "With Foster. The way you didn't flinch." He paused. "Most people would have." She turned to look at him. "My father didn't raise me to flinch." "No," he said. "He didn't." He paused. "He raised you to stand still when things came at you and figure out what they actually were." She looked at him for a moment. This man who had stopped at a fence line 3 days ago because something was wrong, and he didn't need a reason beyond that, who had kept a map and 12 months of correspondence against a machine that had broken a man's fingers for asking questions, who had written letters to judges that nobody answered and kept writing them anyway. "So did yours," she said. He went still. "Whatever he taught you," she said. "Whatever your mother taught you, you've been doing the same thing, standing still and figuring out what the thing actually is." She paused. "You've just been doing it alone." He didn't say anything for a moment. The rain was still coming down outside, lighter now, the storm moving east, but steady. "Go cook," he said. His voice was rougher than usual. She went. She was pulling biscuits from the oven when Dockery came into the kitchen with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who'd been deciding something for a while and had finally decided. "The man that came this afternoon," he said. "Foster." "Yes, he wasn't alone." He turned his hat over in his hands. "I didn't want to say so in front of him, but there were 2 men on the ridge road. I saw them when I took Foster's horse around to the post. They weren't moving, just watching the gate." Eleanor set the biscuit pan on the stovetop. "Did they see you see them?" she said. "I don't think so. I didn't look long." "Good." She kept her voice steady. "Dockery, how many of the hands can you trust completely?" "All 6, he said without hesitation. "Good," she said again. "Go tell Calloway what you told me, and then quietly, without any fuss, I need 2 of your most reliable men watching the ridge road tonight." Dockery nodded. He started for the door. "Dockery." He turned. "Tell them not to confront anyone, just watch and count." She paused. "I want to know how many there are before morning." "Yes, ma'am," he said. He left. Eleanor stood in the kitchen and thought about the 2 men on the ridge road, and what it meant that Halverson had sent Foster in the front door and watchers in the back, and she thought about her father's letter that he'd never sent, and the 4 days between writing it and dying, and she thought about the particular arithmetic of a man who was not afraid of removing obstacles. She was an obstacle now. She knew it. She felt it in the specific way you feel something real. Not panic, but the clean, sharp attention of a person whose body has correctly identified a danger and is reporting it without editorializing. She was frightened. She was also her father's daughter. And her father's daughter didn't stop moving because she was frightened. She put supper together with the same hands she always used, and they didn't shake. And when Calloway came into the kitchen 30 minutes later with Dockery's news already behind his eyes and the particular set to his jaw of a man who had made a decision, she put his supper in front of him and sat down across from him and said, "We have until morning to decide how to play this." "Aldridge," he said. "Aldridge can't be here by morning. He's 20 miles away and we can't risk a rider attracting attention." She looked at him. "What we have is what's here." "6 good hands," he said. "And the house." "And everything we brought back from Bitter Creek," she said. "And the letter to Daniel, which you need to write after supper." She paused. "And one other thing." He looked at her. She reached into the satchel which she'd brought to the kitchen with her because she wasn't leaving it in another room. She pulled out the survey authorization and set it on the table between them. "Roland Voss's name is on this document," she said, "in connection with a federal authorization. If something happens to us before we can get this to Aldridge." She held his gaze. "We need a copy somewhere they can't reach. Somewhere Halverson doesn't know to look." "Where?" Calloway said. Eleanor thought for the moment. "Does Daniel have a mailing address in Colorado City?" she said. Something moved through Calloway's face, something he'd been keeping on a short leash since they'd talked in the wagon. "Yes," he said. "Then the copy goes to Daniel tonight," she said. "In a plain envelope with your handwriting. No explanation. Just the documents." She paused. "The letter explaining everything goes separately. First thing tomorrow." Calloway looked at the survey authorization on the table. He looked at her. "When this is over," he said slowly, "I'm going to have a long conversation with myself about how I thought this week was going to go." "When this is over," she said, "I'll have that conversation with you." She stood up and started clearing the table. "Write the letter. I'll copy the documents." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Eleanor." She stopped. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him, this man who'd offered her a room when she had none, and wages when she had nothing, and stood beside her in Aldridge's office while she laid out the evidence of her own father's murder on a deputy marshal's desk. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me when Roland Voss is in front of a judge." His mouth did the thing that was almost a smile. "I'll thank you now and again then," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer than she meant to. Then she went to copy the documents because there was work to do, and the night was already short enough, and some things, the things that lived in that moment longer than she meant to, were best kept where they were until the storm had passed and the ridge road was clear and the morning came with less weight in it. Outside, the rain had stopped. The 2 men on the ridge road were still there. And somewhere in Cheyenne, Roland Voss was waiting for a report from Foster that was not going to say what he expected it to say. Dockery's men counted 4. He came to the kitchen door at 11 that night with his hat in his hands and his voice low and reported it the way he reported everything plainly without drama. Because Dockery had lived long enough to know that drama was what happened when plain facts ran out of road. 4 men on the ridge, 2 at the eastern gate, 2 more positioned along the fence line toward the creek. All of them mounted, none of them moving. "Watching," Eleanor said. "Watching." Dockery confirmed. Calloway stood at the kitchen table with the letter to Daniel half written in front of him, and looked at Dockery with the expression of a man rearranging his plans at speed. "They're not coming in tonight," he said. "If they were coming in tonight, they'd have come already." "They want to know who's here," Eleanor said. "How many hands? Whether we sent anyone to Aldridge." She paused. They're counting. Let them count, Calloway said. He looked at Dockery. I want 2 men on rotating watch through the night. 2 hours on, 2 hours off. Nobody makes a move toward the ridge. We give them nothing to respond to. And if they make a move first, Dockery said. Then we respond, Calloway said, quiet and final. Dockery put his hat back on and went out. Calloway looked at Eleanor across the table. You should sleep, he said. I'll sleep when the letter is finished, she said. Let me read what you have. He turned the letter so she could see it. She read it standing up, leaning over the table, and she read it the way she read everything completely, without skipping attending to what the words were actually doing, rather than what they appeared to be doing. It was a good letter. Direct. His son's name at the top, the situation laid out in clear sentences. The request specific, come to Wyoming quietly, by the fastest route, bring nothing that marks you as associated with this property. Add one thing, she said. What? Tell him his father needs him. She looked at Calloway directly. Not the ranch, not the case. His father. Calloway looked at the letter. He picked up the pen. She went to bed at midnight and slept the specific sleep of the genuinely exhausted, deep, dreamless, an accounting of a body that had been asked for more than usual and was collecting the debt. She woke at 4:30 to the sound of a horse on the yard. One horse. Coming in fast from the north road, not the ridge she registered, that before she was fully awake, the direction mattering in a way she couldn't immediately explain. She was dressed and in the hallway before the knock came. Calloway was already at the door. The man outside was young mid-20s, lean and travel-worn with a federal postal rider's bag over one shoulder, and the particular breathlessness of someone who'd been riding hard for reasons he wasn't entirely clear on. Message for James Calloway, he said. Marked urgent, from Deputy Marshal Aldridge. Calloway took it. He stepped back inside and broke the seal and read it with Eleanor reading over his shoulder because there was no time left for standing on ceremony. Aldridge had moved faster than any of them had expected. The note was short, 5 sentences. The substance of it was this: within 3 hours of Eleanor and Calloway leaving his office, someone had broken into the county recorder's office in Bitter Creek. Simmons had been knocked unconscious. 2 files were missing: the survey authorization and the Voss estate amendment. The originals, not copies. The files Eleanor had read and left in place were gone. She stood very still for a moment. He knew we were there, she said. Within hours, Calloway said. He was already folding the note. He has someone in that office. Simmons, Eleanor said. Maybe, or someone who watches Simmons. He looked at her. The originals are gone, which means the only copies of those documents are what we brought back. And what I sent to Daniel last night, Eleanor said. He stopped. She held his gaze. The copies I made before supper. The envelope I asked Dockery to give to the morning rider. She paused. Except I didn't ask Dockery to give it to the morning rider. I asked Dockery to have one of the hands ride it to the Clearwater relay station last night, separate from any regular post addressed to Daniel under your name. Calloway stared at her. You did that last night, he said. I thought we might need it, she said. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the ranch was holding its nighttime stillness, the watchers on the ridge still there, still counting. When, he said, did you decide to do that? When Foster came, she said. The estate claim, the specific language. She paused. A man who breaks into a recorder's office within 3 hours of a visit doesn't do that for documents he's only just learned about. He does it for documents he's been worried about for a long time. She looked at Calloway. Roland Voss has been afraid of that survey authorization since the day he filed it. He knew what it exposed. He was just waiting to find out who had finally looked at it. You, Calloway said. Me, she agreed. So yes. Last night I made sure that if they came for the documents here, the copies would already be beyond reach. He looked at her for another moment. Then he went to the window and looked out at the yard at the pre-dawn dark that was just beginning to separate itself from true night. We have maybe 2 hours before they expect us to be rattled enough to make a mistake. he said. Then we don't make one, Eleanor said. We send word to Aldridge that the copies are safe and in transit, and then we do something they're not expecting. He turned around. What? We go to them, she said. Not the men on the ridge, we go to Roland Voss. Calloway said nothing for a moment. He's in Cheyenne, he said. He's in Cheyenne waiting for a report that's going to tell him his operation is unraveling, Eleanor said. He's expecting us to defend, to sit on the ranch, wait for lawyers, work through slow legal channels. She kept her voice steady. What he's not expecting is for Thomas Voss's daughter to walk into his office in Cheyenne and tell him directly what she knows and what she has, and give him exactly one opportunity to step back from what he's built before it comes down on top of him. That's dangerous, Calloway said. It's dangerous to wait too, she said. Those men on the ridge don't scare me as much as a long legal fight with a federal commissioner in his pocket and a county attorney on his payroll. We have the documents. We have Daniel with the copies. We have Aldridge. But we have a window, and the window is right now while he doesn't know exactly what we found and what we sent and who has it. Calloway was quiet for a long time. She watched him think, not the fast reactive thinking of a man surprised, but the deep structural thinking of a man who had been building something for years and understood when the final piece was in position. Not alone, he said finally. No, she agreed. Not alone. They left at first light with Dockery driving, and Calloway and Eleanor in the bed of a second wagon. Not the supply wagon, one of the work wagons, unremarkable, the kind of thing that moved through a town without anyone looking at it twice. Two of the hands rode ahead at a distance. Two more stayed at the ranch. The men on the ridge were gone by the time they rolled through the eastern gate. That was the thing that troubled Eleanor most. Not their presence the night before, but their absence now. Men don't leave a position they've been ordered to hold unless they've received a different order. Someone had called them back. Someone who'd had a report from Foster by now and was reacting to what the report said. He knows we're not sitting still, she said. He's guessing, Calloway said. Roland doesn't guess, he calculates. She looked at the empty road where the watchers had been. He's pulling them back because he's about to change the approach. The estate claim was the polite version. The watchers were the warning version. She paused. What comes next is neither. Which is why we're not here when it arrives, Calloway said. They made Cheyenne in 4 hours. The city hit them like a different world, not the scale of it, but the specific noise, the accumulation of human transactions in a small space. The way everyone was moving somewhere with the urgency of commerce. Eleanor had grown up in towns smaller than this. She read it the way she read accounts, looking for the structure underneath the activity. R.W. Voss and Associates occupied the upper floor of a 2-story brick building on the main commercial street. The sign on the door was dignified, modest, the sign of a man who wanted to appear established rather than aggressive. Eleanor stood in front of it for a moment. Calloway stood beside her. If this goes wrong, he started. Dockery knows where we are, she said. Aldridge's copy of our evidence summary went this morning with the second writer. Daniel has the document copies. She looked at the door. Roland can't unmake what's already been made. That's not what I was going to say, Calloway said. She looked at him. I was going to say, he said more quietly, that if this goes wrong, it won't be because of anything you did or didn't do. You've done everything right. He paused. I just want you to know I see that. Before we go in. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. The morning was bright and noisy around them, and she stood in it with a man who had stopped at a fence line 6 days ago for no reason except that something was wrong, and he didn't need a better reason than that. Let's go, she said. The man behind the desk was not what Eleanor had expected, and she'd spent 6 days constructing the expectation carefully, which meant that her uncle was better at this than she'd given him credit for. Roland Voss was 60 years old, which she knew, but he wore it lightly. A trim man with silver hair and her father's eyes. And that was the part that hit her in the chest when she walked in because she hadn't prepared for it. Her father's eyes in a different face. The same shape, the same gray, but without the warmth her father's eyes worn by a man who had never learned to use them the same way. He stood up. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Calloway. He didn't look surprised. "Eleanor?" he said, like he was settling a weight he'd been carrying. "Uncle Roland," she said. "You look like your father," he said. "I know," she said. "He taught me to keep accounts." Something moved in Roland's face, a very small adjustment, like a man shifting his stance before a long conversation. He gestured at the chairs in front of his desk. "Sit down." "We'll stand," Calloway said. Roland looked at him. "Mr. Calloway?" A pause. "I've been expecting to meet you for some time." "I imagine," Calloway said. Roland sat back down. He folded his hands on the desk in front of him with the ease of a man who had conducted difficult conversations in this room before and understood the geometry of them. "I assume you didn't come to Cheyenne to sit across from my desk and feel righteous," he said. "You came because you want something. I want you to understand what we have," Eleanor said. "Completely, without your attorneys filtering it." She put the satchel on his desk, not opening it, just placing it. "The survey authorization with your name on the petition. Emmett Crane's signature on my father's estate amendment dated 6 weeks before his death, matching the same signature on your survey challenge filing. Gerald Halverson's fee payments from 2 separate properties traced to a private account. Western Meridian Land Holdings, registered by Philip Delacroix, a 19-year-old boy who I expect had no idea what he was putting his name to." She kept her voice level. "And the testimony of a retired federal land commissioner named Arthur Webb, who spoke to a law student from Colorado City yesterday afternoon and was apparently very interested in discussing the 11 authorizations he signed over 5 years and whether he'd been fully informed about the nature of the petitions." Roland was very still. "Daniel Calloway," Eleanor said. "First year at Colorado City School of Law. As it turns out, very persuasive in person." Calloway said nothing. He didn't need to. "You spoke to Webb," Roland said. His voice had changed, not broken, but thinned the way ice thins before it goes. "Daniel spoke to Webb," Eleanor said. "Yesterday, before the break-in at the Bitter Creek Recorder's office, which Deputy Marshal Aldridge is currently investigating as a federal offense." She paused. "The original documents are gone. The copies are not. Webb's testimony is now on the record with the federal marshal's office in Denver." "Denver," Roland said. "Aldridge didn't trust the Wyoming district," she said. "He filed with Denver 2 days ago." That was the one she had been saving. She watched it land. She watched her uncle, this man who had measured everything he touched his whole life, who had come west because the West had more to measure. She watched him calculate the new landscape and find it was not the one he'd been standing on. "The holding company," he said slowly, "will be traced," Eleanor said. "Philip Delacroix will be interviewed. He'll tell them everything he knows, which I suspect is not much, but it will be enough." She paused. "You built this to last a long time, Roland. It was patient work. But you built it on my father's land, and my father taught me how to read everything he built." The office was very quiet. "Thomas," Roland said. "Not to either of them. Just the name said out loud, the way people say the name of someone they haven't let themselves think about, and then suddenly can't stop thinking about." "He wrote a letter," Eleanor said, "the week before he died. He never sent it. It was in the ledger." She kept her voice steady because she had decided she was going to say this, and she was going to say it plain. "He asked questions about the survey. The right questions. If he'd sent that letter, he would have found what I found." She looked at her uncle directly. "He didn't send it. 4 weeks later he had a fever. He was dead in 4 days." The silence that followed was the kind that contains everything and says nothing. "I didn't," Roland started. "Don't," Calloway said. Quiet and hard. "Whatever you were going to say. Don't." Roland stopped. He looked at Calloway with the expression of a man who has just understood the complete dimensions of a situation he thought he had measured. "What do you want?" Roland said to Eleanor. "The eastern boundary restored to the 1871 filing," she said. "The survey process terminated. Every fee payment returned to both properties with interest, which Halverson will fund since he handled the accounts." She paused. "The Voss estate filing reverted to my father's original document, which means the property comes back into proper inheritance proceedings without Marguerite's amendments and without Crane's signature." "That will take time," Roland said. "Legally, Halverson will move quickly once he understands his alternative," she said. "Men who've been arranging broken fingers tend to become cooperative when federal charges are on the table." She paused. "And Marguerite?" Roland looked at her. "She gets nothing from the Voss property," Eleanor said. "Her arrangement with you is dissolved. She leaves the house, which will be sold at fair value through proper estate proceedings." She paused. "She wasn't the architect of this. I know that. But she was willing. Willingness has a cost." "And Philip," Roland said. Eleanor thought about Philip on the porch, with his arms crossed, and his mother's calculations already settling into his face. She thought about a boy who'd learned weather by watching a storm. "Philip gets the opportunity to be something different than what his mother made him," she said. "He cooperates fully with the federal investigation. He provides every document he signed and every instruction he received. In exchange, Deputy Marshal Aldridge has indicated that a 19-year-old registration agent who was demonstrably unaware of the fraudulent purpose of his registration is unlikely to face federal prosecution." She paused. "That offer expires when Halverson is in custody, which will be soon." Roland looked at her for a long time. She let him look. "You're 23 years old," he said. "I am," she said. "Thomas taught you this." "My father taught me to read what's actually there," she said. "Not what someone tells you is there." She looked at him steadily. "You underestimated that. You underestimated me. You built everything on the assumption that a young woman sold for 20 coins on a Tuesday morning, had nothing and knew nothing, and would disappear into a stableman's yard and not be heard from again." She picked up the satchel. "That was your mistake." Roland Voss looked at his folded hands. He looked at the desk. He looked at the window. And then he did something Eleanor had not expected. He reached into the top drawer of his desk, and he took out a key, and he unlocked the lower left drawer, and he removed a ledger, a thick one leather-bound, considerably more organized than anything Eleanor had been working from, and he set it on the desk. "Gerald Halverson's personal accounts," he said. "From the beginning." He paused. "I kept a copy because I'm not a fool, and I knew that a man like Halverson keeps his own records for his own protection." He looked at Eleanor. "This is every transaction, every property, every amount, every name." Eleanor looked at the ledger. She looked at Roland. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Because your father was a better man than I was," he said. "And I knew it when I was 30 years old, and I was still deciding it didn't matter, and I've been deciding it doesn't matter for 30 more years." He pushed the ledger toward her. "Take it. Give it to your marshal. Let it do what it does." She took it. She held it for a moment. "Did you know about the fever?" she said. Roland looked at his desk. "I told Halverson that your father was asking questions," he said. "I didn't tell him to." He stopped. "I didn't ask what he did with the information." "That's not the same as not knowing," Eleanor said. "No," he said. "It isn't." The office was very quiet. Calloway stood beside Eleanor and said nothing, because there was nothing to add to what had just been admitted in this room. Eleanor put the ledger in her satchel. She straightened up. She looked at her uncle, this old man with her father's eyes, who had spent 30 years deciding it didn't matter and had finally run out of road. "Federal marshals will be here this afternoon," she said. "Don't leave Cheyenne." She walked out. Calloway followed. He fell into step beside her on the stairs, and they went down and out into the morning noise of Cheyenne, and he didn't say anything until they'd reached the wagon where Dockery was waiting, with an expression that asked everything without words. "We got it," Calloway said to Dockery. Dockery let out a breath he'd apparently been holding for some time. Eleanor climbed up onto the wagon seat and sat with Halverson's ledger on her lap, and her father's satchel over her shoulder, and let the morning noise of the city move around her. Her hands were steady. She checked because she wanted to know. Steady. "Eleanor," Calloway said, climbing up beside her. "I'm all right," she said. "I know you are," he said. "I wasn't going to ask." He looked forward toward the road that would take them back to the relay station where Aldridge was already waiting, where they'd arranged to meet before coming here because Calloway planned ahead even when he didn't say so. "I was going to say—" He stopped, started again. "Your father would have been proud of you." She had been holding that particular thing at arm's length for 6 days. She'd needed to hold it at arm's length to do the work. She'd known that about herself and been deliberate about it the way her father had taught her to be deliberate about things that mattered. She let it in now. She breathed. "He would have argued with half my decisions," she said. "Probably," Calloway said, "and then he would have been proud." She smiled. It was the first time in 6 days that something in her face had moved in that direction, and it felt like something coming back to life after a long winter, tentative, unsure of the warmth, but real. "Let's go find Aldridge," she said. Done. Aldridge was at the relay station with 2 additional federal deputies and a warrant that had come through from Denver at 7 that morning, faster than any of them had expected, which told Eleanor something about how long the Denver office had been waiting for exactly this kind of case to arrive in exactly this kind of shape. He looked at Halverson's ledger the way a starving man looks at a meal. "Where did you get this?" he said. "Roland Voss," Eleanor said. "He's at his office. He's expecting you." Aldridge looked up at her. "He gave it to you." "He did. Why?" She thought about her uncle's face. The way he'd said her father's name, just the name out loud, like something he'd been carrying and couldn't carry anymore. "Because some debts get heavy enough that people need to put them down," she said. "Even if putting them down costs everything." Aldridge looked at the ledger again. He opened it. He read 2 pages. He closed it. "Halverson is in Bitter Creek," he said. "I'll have him by tonight." He looked at his deputies. "Crane is in Laramie Johnson. You take Crane. Webb." "Webb already spoke to Daniel Calloway," Eleanor said. "He knows what's happening. He's cooperative." Aldridge looked at Calloway. "Your boy." "My boy," Calloway said. "Tell him he did good work," Aldridge said. Something crossed Calloway's face, the thing that lived past pride in the quieter country. Past it. "I'll tell him," he said. "Marguerite Voss," Aldridge said to Eleanor. "You said she was a willing participant." "She was," Eleanor said. "She also has a 19-year-old son, who she used as a registration agent without telling him what he was registering for." She paused. "I'd like the son to have a chance." "That's between him and the federal attorney," Aldridge said. "I know," she said. "I'm asking you to say what I said, that he cooperated fully voluntarily before charges were filed." Aldridge looked at her for a moment. "You're asking me to speak on behalf of the son of a woman who had your father's daughter sold for 20 coins. I'm asking you to let a 19-year-old boy have a different life than the one his mother put him in," Eleanor said. "Those are different things." Aldridge was quiet for a moment. "I'll note it in my report," he said. "That's what I can do." "That's what I'm asking for," she said. He gathered the ledger and the warrant and his deputies and left the relay station in a directed, purposeful movement that had the quality of a long-dammed river finally finding its way through. Eleanor stood and watched them go. Calloway stood beside her. "Dockery is bringing the wagon around," he said after a moment. "All right," she said. "We should get back," he said. "Daniel's letter will arrive in 4 days. He'll be on a horse the day after he reads it." A pause. "He'll want to meet you." She looked at him. "Will he?" "I told him about you," he said, not explaining further, just placing the fact where she could see it. She thought about the letter he'd written at the kitchen table, the letter she'd read over his shoulder. The part she'd suggested he add, and the part she hadn't read and would not ask about because some things a man writes to his son are his own. "I'd like to meet him," she said, They stood in the morning for a moment, just a moment, the two of them in a relay station outside Cheyenne on a summer day that had started to believe in itself again after weeks of punishing heat. The air had weight, and the particular clarity that comes after rain, after breaking weather, after things that have been stuck for too long finally move. "Eleanor," Calloway said. I've been thinking about the East Room," he said. She looked at him sideways. "What about it?" "It's a good room," he said. "Good light in the mornings." A pause. "Be a shame if you left." She was quiet for a moment. "I have accounts to keep," she said. 3 years of miscellaneous charges to reconcile, and a property inheritance to navigate through proper proceedings. She paused. "That'll take some time." "Yes," he said. "It will." "And someone should keep your household ledger," she said. "Given what happens when it's left unattended." "Given that," he agreed. She looked forward at the road that ran back toward the ranch, toward the eastern ridge where the spring ran, and the boundary markers stood where they'd stood since 1871, 40 feet inside what was, and always had been, his property. "The East Room has good light," she said. "It does," he said. Dockery brought the wagon around. They got in. They drove. The summer, which had been punishing and ruthless and relentless, had finally, somewhere in the hours between a woman walking into her uncle's office and walking back out with the weight of it resolved, decided to become something else. Not easier, not softer, just honest. Which was Eleanor Voss had always believed the only kind of summer worth having. Gerald Halverson was arrested in Bitter Creek on a Thursday evening, 3 hours after Aldridge left the relay station. Eleanor heard about it from Dockery, who heard it from the hand who'd ridden to town for flour, and come back with considerably more than that. Halverson had been at his office when Aldridge walked in with 2 deputies and a federal warrant, and by all accounts he'd gone quietly, not because he was a man inclined toward dignity, but because he'd understood in the first 10 seconds of looking at Aldridge's face that the architecture he'd built over 5 years had come down and there was nothing left to protect. Emmett Crane was taken in Laramie the same evening. He asked for a lawyer before he finished his first sentence, which Aldridge had noted in his report as the response of a man who knew exactly what he'd done. Roland Voss remained in his office in Cheyenne, as he'd said he would. Eleanor thought about that on the drive back to the ranch. The particular quality of a man who had finally stopped running from something he'd been moving away from his whole life and had simply sat down and waited for it to arrive. She didn't have a name for what she felt about her uncle. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever. It wasn't hatred either, though she'd felt something close to it in the hours between finding his name on the survey authorization and walking into his office. What she felt now was something quieter and more complicated, the specific grief of understanding that a person you should have been able to trust had made themselves untrustworthy so thoroughly and so long ago that the person they might have been was almost impossible to find inside the person they'd become. Her father had seen it at 30 years old. Her father had been right. She let herself think about that for a while, and then she put it away because there was work still to do, and the wagon was pulling into the ranch gate as the sun went long and flat across the valley, and Dockery was already calling to the hands, and the ordinary noise of an evening on a working ranch was wrapping itself around everything like something solid. Calloway helped her down from the wagon. His hand was where it needed to be, as it always was. "Supper," she said. "I'll help," he said. She looked at him. In the 6 days she'd been at the ranch, he had not once offered to help with supper. "You cook," she said. "No," he said. "But I can carry things and stay out of the way." "That's a valuable skill," she said. "Come on." They ate late that night, just the two of them, after the hands had eaten in the bunkhouse, and Dockery had made his final rounds, and the ranch had settled into its nighttime self. Eleanor made the last of the salt pork with potatoes and onions, simple and honest, and set it on the table with bread she'd baked that afternoon, and coffee that had been going since 6. Calloway ate the way he'd eaten the first night, completely, without performance attending to the food, with the respect of a man who understood what it meant to have been without it. "Tell me about Daniel," Eleanor said. He looked up. "When he was young," she said. "Before the law school." He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a man accessing something he doesn't open often. He was a serious child, he said. Not solemn, he laughed, he played, he gave us considerable trouble in the usual ways. But serious underneath. His mother used to say he came into the world already thinking. A pause. He was 9 when she died. He handled it differently than I did. How did you handle it? Eleanor said. Badly, Calloway said without hedging. I worked. I didn't stop working for about 2 years. Dockery raised Daniel as much as I did during that stretch, which is a debt I haven't fully paid. He paused. Daniel never blamed me. That almost made it worse. Children are often better at grief than their parents. Eleanor said. He was, Calloway said. He'd sit with me in the evenings when I'd come in from the work and just be there, 12 years old, not saying anything, just present. Like he understood that sometimes a person doesn't need words, they need someone to stay. Eleanor looked at her coffee. He sounds like his father, she said. Calloway looked at her. A man who stops at a fence line, she said. Because something is wrong and doesn't need a better reason than that. That's a man who taught his son that sometimes you just stay. She paused. That's not nothing, Calloway. That's most of what matters. He was quiet for a long time. The ranch was silent around them, the summer dark outside the kitchen window. The lamp on the table making everything close and warm. His letter will reach Colorado City in 2 more days, Calloway said. He'll be on a horse by Sunday. Then we'll have things ready by the time he arrives, Eleanor said. What things? The estate proceedings will need a legal mind to navigate, she said. The federal case will need someone who can read the documents we've compiled and structure them for presentation. She paused. A first-year law student with sharp instincts and no existing reputation in Wyoming is in an interesting position to do a great deal of useful work. Calloway almost smiled. You're already putting him to work. I'm planning ahead, she said. That's different. He did smile then fully for the first time she'd seen it, and it changed his face in a way she hadn't anticipated. Not softened it exactly. Revealed it. The way weather reveals the actual shape of a mountain when the clouds move off. She looked at her plate. The Voss property, she said. When the estate goes through proper proceedings, I don't want it back. He looked at her. Eleanor, I want it sold, she said. At fair value through legitimate proceedings with the proceeds held in trust. She paused. There's a family on the property's western edge, the Harmon family, 3 children, been farming a rented plot for 6 years. They don't have the capital to buy, but they have the labor and the knowledge. She looked at Calloway. A trust could hold the property and lease it to them at a fair rate until they've built enough capital to purchase it at the assessed value. He was quiet. It was my father's land, she said. He cared about it. He'd want it with people who care about it too. She paused. I don't need to own it to honor him. Calloway looked at her for a long moment. You've been thinking about this for a while. Since the wagon ride back from Cheyenne, she said. I had time. He was quiet for another moment. Daniel can set up the trust structure, he said, once he's here. That's what I thought, she said. She started clearing the table. He picked up plates without being asked, which was different from every previous evening, and she noticed it and didn't say anything about it, which felt like its own kind of conversation. The thing she hadn't expected came 4 days later on a Sunday morning while she was in the kitchen starting breakfast. She heard the horse before she heard anything else. One horse coming up the north road at a pace that wasn't urgent, but wasn't casual either. The pace of someone who'd been riding for days and was maintaining discipline past the point of exhaustion. She looked out the kitchen window and saw Calloway already in the yard, standing at the gate with his hat in his hands. And she knew before the rider came through what the shape of the next few minutes was going to be. She stayed in the kitchen. She stayed in the kitchen because some things don't need a witness, and a man meeting his son after a year of kept distance, while everything he'd built was under threat, was one of them. She put water on for coffee and measured out flour for biscuits, and listened to the sounds from the yard, the horse stopping the quiet exchange of voices she couldn't hear clearly, and then a long silence that had a texture to it. The silence of two people who have stopped talking because talking is insufficient. Dockery came into the kitchen 10 minutes later with the expression of a man who had seen something he was glad he'd seen. "He's here," Dockery said. "I know," Eleanor said. "How many biscuits can a law student from Colorado eat?" Dockery considered this. "More than you'd think," he said. "He rode 4 days straight." "8 biscuits," she said. "Go tell them breakfast is in 20 minutes. Yeah. Daniel Calloway was 21 years old, and he had his father's hands and his mother's eyes, Eleanor decided, or the eyes his father described his mother as having, which were dark and quick, and missed very little. He was leaner than James, not yet grown into his full frame, and he had the specific energy of a young man who had been given an urgent problem and had been turning it over in his mind for 4 days on horseback and had arrived with opinions. He shook Eleanor's hand at the kitchen table and looked at her with those quick eyes and said, "You're the one who went to Roland Voss's office." "I am," she said. "My father's letter said you walked in and laid out what you had and gave him one chance to step back from it," he said. "Was that the actual plan, or did it happen that way?" "Both," she said. "Sit down." He sat. James sat beside him, and there was something in the way the two of them sat close without ceremony, the specific ease of people who have been genuinely glad to see each other and have set the relief down somewhere internal and are now prepared to work, that made Eleanor think about her father again. The way he'd sit beside her at the kitchen table when she was learning the accounts, close and easy and present. She put biscuits and coffee on the table and sat down herself. "Arthur Webb," she said to Daniel. "Tell me exactly what he said." Daniel wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and began. He'd arrived in Webb's town, a small place outside Colorado City, on a Friday afternoon, presenting himself as a law student researching federal land authorization procedures for a thesis on Western property adjudication. Webb had been, he said, initially cautious. A retired man who received a young law student asking about his career was not a man without suspicion. "He changed about 40 minutes in," Daniel said. "I wasn't pushing. I was genuinely asking about the process, how authorizations were initiated, what documentation was required. Textbook stuff." He paused. "And then I asked specifically about the Wyoming district, the 11 authorizations over 5 years. He looked at Eleanor. He went quiet, not defensive quiet, tired quiet, like a man who's been waiting for someone to ask the right question. "What did he say?" Calloway said. "He said he'd been given to understand that the petitions from Wyoming were standard boundary resolutions following the homestead consolidation period," Daniel said. "That the federal land office in Denver had recommended the review process as a way of settling accumulated disputes cleanly." He paused. "He said the recommendation came from someone senior at the Denver office, someone he trusted." "Who?" Eleanor said. Daniel set down his coffee cup. "A deputy commissioner named Charles Aldridge," he said. The kitchen went absolutely still. Eleanor heard it, the name landing, and the specific silence that followed it, and the sound of everything she thought she understood rearranging itself into a different shape. "Aldridge," she said. Her voice was level. "Charles Aldridge," Daniel said. "Not Tom. Tom Aldridge is the deputy marshal in Bitter Creek. Charles Aldridge was a deputy commissioner at the Denver Federal Land Office. Retired 14 months ago." He looked at his father. Same month Tom Aldridge started filing complaints that went nowhere. James Calloway had gone very still. "They're related," Eleanor said. "Brothers," Daniel said. "I checked before I left Colorado City." He looked at Eleanor directly. "Tom Aldridge filed the federal complaint with the Denver office. The Denver office where his brother worked until 14 months ago. The brother who told Arthur Webb that the Wyoming survey authorizations were standard procedure." Eleanor sat back in her chair. She thought about Aldridge at his desk, the specific way he'd looked at the documents she'd brought him. The way he'd said, "I've had his name on a list for 14 months. 14 months. The same month Charles Aldridge retired from the Denver office. The same month the complaints that Tom Aldridge filed started going nowhere. She thought about Aldridge telling her not to come back to Bitter Creek, giving them instructions to go home and wait. She thought about the men on the ridge the night after they visited his office, positioned around the ranch, watching and counting. He sent the evidence to Denver, she said slowly, where his brother's colleagues still work, people who might protect what Charles Aldridge authorized. Or people his brother warned, Daniel said, before the complaints arrived. Halverson was arrested, James said. Aldridge arrested him personally. Yes, Eleanor said. She was thinking fast, running the accounts the way her father had taught her, looking at what was actually there, rather than what she'd been told was there. But what did we give Aldridge? The survey authorization, the estate amendment, Halverson's personal ledger. She looked at them both. We gave him the evidence that ends Halverson. We gave him the evidence that ends Crane and Rowland and the holding company. You gave him everything that ends the operators, Daniel said quietly. But the person who authorized the federal process from above? Charles Aldridge, Eleanor said. His brother, Daniel confirmed. The biscuits were going cold on the table. Nobody reached for them. Tom Aldridge is not going to prosecute his brother, Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. Not if he can find a way to close the case without it, Daniel said. Halverson in custody. Crane cooperating. Roland Voss cooperating. The holding company dissolved. He paused. A very clean resolution that leaves the man who made it all federally possible quietly retired in Colorado. James Calloway looked at Eleanor. You trusted Aldridge. I trusted the evidence, she said. I trusted that the evidence was too substantial for anyone to bury. She paused. I was right about that. I was wrong about who would control where it went. She stood up. Daniel, she said, the copies you have. The survey authorization, the estate amendment, Webb's testimony. Where are they? In my saddlebag, he said immediately. I didn't leave them at any relay station. I've had them on my person since Colorado City. Good, she said. I need you to make 3 additional copies today. Identical. Complete. She looked at him. Can you do that? Give me 4 hours, he said. You have 3, she said. You rode 4 days, you can write for 3 hours. She turned to James. Who do you trust in the federal system? Not Wyoming District. Not Denver. Calloway thought for a moment. Not long. Judge Harlan Morrison, he said. Federal Circuit, based in St. Louis. He rode through this district 7 years ago on an inspection tour. We spoke. He's the one I should have written to from the beginning. Why didn't you? Eleanor said. Because I didn't have what you found, he said simply. Write to Morrison today, she said. Send the original copies with the letter, not through the Bitter Creek Postal Office, directly through the Cheyenne Federal Post. She paused. And send 1 copy to the Territorial Governor's Office, and 1 to the Denver Post. James blinked. The newspaper. A federal land fraud scheme involving a retired deputy commissioner and a network of forged authorizations across 5 years is a story, Eleanor said. A story that's been printed and distributed cannot be buried by a deputy marshal protecting his brother. She looked at them both. We don't need Tom Aldridge to prosecute Charles Aldridge. We need someone with jurisdiction over both of them to have no choice but to act because the alternative is worse. Daniel looked at his father. His father looked at Daniel. She's right, Daniel said. I know, James said. Write the letter, Eleanor said to James. I'll help you with the language. She looked at Daniel. Start copying. Daniel was already reaching for his saddlebag. The copies were finished by noon. James's letter to Judge Morrison was drafted revised twice and sealed by 1 in the afternoon. Eleanor wrote the letter to the territorial governor herself in her clearest hand, with the account of events dated and signed with her full name. Eleanor Margaret Voss, daughter of Thomas Edward Voss, late of Boundary County, Wyoming. She signed her full name. Because her father had taught her that a person who used their whole name stood behind what they signed, and she intended to stand behind every word of it. The third copy went into an envelope addressed to the Denver Post City desk, with a cover note that was 3 sentences long and told the absolute minimum necessary to make an editor understand what they were holding. Dockery rode to Cheyenne personally in the afternoon, with all 3 packages in a locked saddlebag and instructions to use the federal postal window and request tracking receipts for each. He was back by evening. It was done. Eleanor stood in the yard after Dockery came back and let herself feel the full weight of the week, not dropping it, not being crushed by it, just letting herself know how heavy it had been, and that she'd carried it, and it was still in her hands, and she had put it where it needed to go. James came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Morrison will act," he said finally. "When that letter arrives with the documentation, he'll act. He's that kind of man." "I know," she said. "The governor's office will refer it to federal jurisdiction," he said, "which takes it out of Wyoming district entirely." "I know. And the newspaper will print it or they won't," she said. "If they print it, the public attention makes everything else move faster. If they don't, we've still sent Morrison and the governor." She paused. "I think they'll print it." "Why?" "Because it's true," she said. "And specific, and documented. Editors like documents." She looked at him sideways. "My father subscribed to 3 newspapers. He said a well-documented story was the closest thing to justice that moved fast enough to matter." James was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like someone I'd have liked to know," he said. "He would have liked you," she said. "He liked men who did what they said they'd do." She paused. "He was suspicious of men who talked too much." "I don't talk too much," James said. "No," she said. "You don't." They stood in the yard as the evening came down and the ranch settled into its familiar sounds, and Daniel appeared in the doorway of the main house, looking like a young man who had ridden 4 days and then written for 3 hours and was now prepared to sleep for approximately 1 decade. "Supper," he called. 20 minutes, Eleanor called back. He disappeared. James looked at her. "He likes you," he said. "He's known me for 8 hours," she said. "He told me in the yard this morning before he met you that anyone who walked into Roland Voss's office with a satchel and a ledger and gave the man 1 chance to stand down was someone worth knowing," James said. "He'd already decided." A pause. "He gets that from his mother. She decided about people quickly, and she was almost never wrong." Eleanor looked at the yard. The horses were settled. The hands had finished their evening work. The ranch was itself again functional spare, organized by the specific efficiency of a man who ran things the way he meant them. Her father's ledger was in the east room on the chest of drawers where she'd put it the first night. She'd go back for it before she slept. She'd been going back for it every night, not reading it, not working through it anymore, just putting her hand on the cover for a moment before she turned out the lamp. It was the closest she could get to telling him. "Calloway," she said. "The east room," she said. "Good light in the mornings." He went very still beside her. She felt it without looking, the specific stillness of a man who has been waiting for something and has suddenly understood it's arrived. "Yes," he said. "I've been thinking about that," she said. "About staying." She paused. "Not as a housekeeper." He turned to look at her. She kept looking at the yard for another moment, because she decided she was going to say this plainly, and plainly required a moment. "I've been on my own for 11 months, she said. "I know what that is. I know what I am when I'm on my own, what I can do, what I don't need." She looked at him now. "I also know what I am these past 6 days working with someone who doesn't try to make me smaller than I am." She held his gaze. "I don't want to go back to being the smaller version." He looked at her for a long time. The evening light was doing what evening light does in Wyoming, making everything honest, washing out the distances, leaving only what was actually there. "Eleanor," he said. His voice was rougher than usual. "I have not said the thing I should say." "Then say it," she said. "I have been alone for 9 years," he said. I told myself I preferred it. I maintained that position with some conviction. He paused. I was wrong. I think I knew I was wrong before Thursday morning of last week, and I know I was wrong every day since. He looked at her steadily, the way he looked at everything he respected directly without hedging. I don't want you to leave. I haven't wanted you to leave since the second morning, when you put the household accounts on the breakfast table and told me to say things out loud. He stopped. I want you to stay. Not in the East Room as a housekeeper, and not at a polite distance that neither one of us would find satisfactory. Boy. He paused. I want you to stay as the woman who built the case that saved this ranch, and cooked the best supper I've eaten in 9 years, and walked into her uncle's office without flinching. He looked at her. That woman. In this house. If she's willing. Eleanor looked at him. She thought about 20 coins counted out in a yard on a Tuesday morning. She thought about a man stopping at a fence line because something was wrong. She thought about a kitchen in the dark, and 2 ledgers side by side, and the particular arithmetic of things that had been broken for a long time, finally finding their way back to balance. I'm willing, she said. He reached over. He took her hand. Not claiming anything. Just his hand over hers, warm and still, the way he'd put it over hers in the street in Bitter Creek, when the weight of what she'd found became briefly too heavy. She let him keep it. Judge Morrison's response arrived 3 weeks later. It was 3 pages long, formal and specific, and it authorized an independent federal investigation into the survey authorization process in the Wyoming District, the Denver Land Office, and the retirement circumstances of one Charles Aldridge, formerly Deputy Commissioner. Tom Aldridge was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. He did not fight it. Eleanor had expected him to, and the fact that he didn't told her something about the man that underneath the calculation about his brother, there was someone who understood when a line had been crossed too far to argue about. Charles Aldridge was formally charged 6 weeks after that. Roland Voss cooperated with the federal investigation so completely and so thoroughly that Daniel, who was managing the documentation, described it to Eleanor one evening as the behavior of a man who had decided that if he was going to go down, he was going to go down, having said the whole truth for once. She didn't know what to do with that. She put it in the same place she'd put the rest of what she felt about her uncle, in the complicated interior space she'd made for it, and moved on. Halverson took a federal plea that gave him 12 years and cost him the Cheyenne practice and every asset tied to the survey operation. Crane negotiated down to 5 years by providing testimony against Charles Aldridge. The Western Meridian Land Holdings Company was dissolved by court order, its assets frozen pending distribution to the property owners who'd been defrauded. The Voss property went into the trust that Daniel structured on a Tuesday afternoon in the ranch kitchen, with Eleanor reading every clause, and James making coffee, and Dockery sitting in the corner, on the basis that he'd been part of this from the beginning, and wasn't about to be excluded from the paperwork. The Harmon family signed the lease agreement the following week. The oldest of the 3 Harmon children, a girl of 14, shook Eleanor's hand at the signing with the grave formality of someone who understood better than most adults what the paper meant. Eleanor shook back with both hands. Marguerite left the Voss property the day the estate order was executed. Eleanor heard about it from the county recorder Simmons, who had recovered from his concussion and had apparently been sufficiently alarmed by the experience to become considerably more attentive about who accessed what files. And she heard that Marguerite had left quietly with Philip and had not said where they were going. Philip had cooperated. He'd gone to Aldridge the day after Foster's visit to the ranch before the arrests, before anyone had asked him to, and he'd laid out everything he knew about the registration, and everything his mother had told him, and everything he suspected she hadn't told him. He was 19 years old. He'd grown up watching a woman operate and had decided at the last possible moment that he didn't want to be the person that education was making him. Eleanor thought that was worth something. She didn't know how much, but something. Daniel stayed through the summer and into the fall. He stayed because there was work the federal case needed documenting the trust, needed administering the estate proceedings, needed a legal mind that wasn't paid by Gerald Halverson. But he also stayed because the Callaway Ranch in summer and early fall was a particular kind of place, and he was 21 years old and had grown up largely without this specific texture of home. And Eleanor understood watching him settle into it, that James had not entirely understood until now what his years of solitary management had cost his son. She told him so one evening. Not harshly, just plainly, because that was how she said things. James listened. He thought about it for 3 days. And then, on a Saturday morning, he went and found Daniel in the study where he was working. And he said what he needed to say, which Eleanor didn't hear and didn't ask about, because some conversations between a father and his son are their own. She knew it had happened because Daniel came to find her afterward and sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and said, "My father says you told him to do that." "I told him you deserved it," she said. "That's different." "Is it?" "Yes," she said. "I told him what I observed. What he did with it was his own." Daniel looked at his coffee. He was quiet for a moment, in the way his father was quiet, not uncomfortably, just thinking. "You do that a lot," he said. "Do what?" "Observe what's true and say it plainly, and then leave room for the person to decide what to do with it." He paused. "Without telling them what to decide." "It's the only way it counts," she said. "If you tell someone what to decide, you haven't helped them. You've replaced them." Daniel looked at her. "My father is going to ask you to marry him," he said. "In case you were wondering." She looked at him sideways. "Are you warning me or endorsing it?" "Endorsing," he said immediately, emphatically. He paused. "He asked me what I thought. I told him I thought he should have asked 6 weeks ago." "He was working up to it," she said. "He's a slow starter," Daniel said. "He's deliberate," she said. "That's different." Daniel smiled. He had his father's almost smile, but he'd developed it further and it came out complete. "You're going to say yes," he said. "That depends entirely on whether he asks the question the right way," she said. "What's the right way?" She thought about it for a moment. "The same way he stopped at a fence line on a Tuesday morning," she said, "because something was right and he didn't need a better reason than that." He asked on a Sunday evening after supper, when the ranch was quiet, and the summer was finally becoming fall, and the air had the particular clarity of a season that has said what it came to say, and is preparing to let something else speak. He didn't make a speech. He didn't reach for elaborate language. He stood in the kitchen where she was washing dishes, and he said her name the way he said it when something mattered with the full weight of it, and she turned around, and he was right there, closer than the ordinary distance, and he had the expression that existed before he decided what to do with whatever was happening to him, except this time he wasn't deciding. He'd already decided. He'd been deciding since a Tuesday morning when he'd stopped at a fence line. "Eleanor," he said. "Stay." She looked at him. She thought about her father's handwriting on the first page of the ledger. She thought about Thomas Edward Voss, who had stood behind his full name and taught his daughter to stand behind hers, and who had deserved better than 4 days, and a fever, and a woman who counted coins. She thought about what it meant to be found not rescued, not claimed, but found by a person who saw what was actually there, and didn't need it to be different. "I'm not leaving," she said. He put his hands on either side of her face, careful, deliberate, like a man handling something important, and he looked at her for a moment. "I should have said it sooner," he said. "You said it the right way," she said. "That's what matters." He kissed her. It was brief and honest, and it tasted like the first honest thing in a very long time, and she put her hand against his chest and felt the steady weight of him, and thought, yes, this is what it is. Abu Chimang. They were married in October in the small church in Bitter Creek, with Daniel standing beside his father, and Dockery, in the third row, looking as uncomfortable in formal clothing as a man who spent 40 years outdoors has any right to look. And Simmons, the county recorder, and his wife taking up the fourth row with the specific satisfied expression of people who feel they've played a small part in something that turned out right. Eleanor wore her mother's brooch, which had been in the lining of the winter coat alongside the $12 hidden there by her father in the months before he died, because Thomas Voss had known his wife's jewelry was valuable and had wanted to make sure his daughter had it. And he'd known without saying so exactly where Eleanor would put the things she needed to keep safe. She'd found it when she finally replaced the lining. She'd held it for a long time before she could put it down. She wore it now. She wore it because he'd known she'd need it for something like this, and she wanted him to be right. James looked at her when she came in, and he went very still. The way he went still when something was more than he'd been braced for. And then the stillness resolved into an expression she'd come to love, the one that lived in him past the careful management, past the years of solitary work, the expression of a man who had let himself be found. She walked to him. He took her hand. The minister said what ministers say. Outside, the October air was coming off the mountains, sharp and clean, and the summer that had been punishing and merciless and relentless was fully gone, resolved into something that breathed. Years later, people in that part of Wyoming still talked about the summer of 1883. They talked about the federal land fraud case that had reached all the way to the Denver commissioner's office. They talked about Gerald Halverson serving his 12 years and never practicing law again. They talked about Roland Voss, who had died in federal custody 2 years after his conviction. Not violently, not dramatically. Just an old man who had finally put down a weight he'd been carrying since he was 30 years old and had perhaps found the laying of it down more definitive than he expected. They talked about the Harmon family who bought the Voss property outright 11 years after the trust was established, who ran it well and fairly, and taught their children what fair dealing looked like because they'd had it modeled for them by a woman who understood that what you do with land matters less than what you do with the people who depend on it. They talked about Daniel Calloway, who became one of the most respected land rights attorneys in the territory. A young man who had ridden 4 days on a horse with copied documents in his saddlebag, and had spent his career making sure that what had happened on that ridge in the summer of 1883 became harder and harder to do to anyone else. And they talked about the Calloway Ranch on the North Ridge, where the spring ran clear all summer because the eastern boundary sat exactly where it had always sat, 40 feet inside the property line. And the water that fed the valley moved as it was meant to move through land that had been honestly held and honestly kept. They talked about James Calloway, who had been a man the whole county described the same way, a man who did what he said, who kept his word, who stopped when something was wrong, because that was reason enough to stop, and who had in the summer of 1883 stopped at a fence line on a Tuesday morning and changed the direction of more than his own life. And they talked about Eleanor. They talked about Eleanor Voss Calloway with the particular warmth that communities reserve for people who have done something real, not grand, not theatrical, but real. A woman who had been sold for 20 silver coins and had used everything her father taught her to take apart the machine that had destroyed him piece by careful piece, and had done it without bitterness and without cruelty, and had given the pieces back to the people they'd been taken from. What they remembered most, those who'd been there for the small parts of it. Simmons at the recorder's desk, Dockery in the barn. The hands who'd watched the Ridge Road that long night was not the legal case, or the arrests, or the federal investigation. What they remembered was smaller and more permanent than that. A woman who arrived with nothing and a ledger, and stood straight when they sold her, and never stopped standing straight, and made something from it that lasted. That is the thing about Eleanor Voss Calloway. She understood from the beginning what her father had tried to tell her, and what she'd finally understood on the morning she'd walked into Tom Aldridge's office and laid her father's ledger on the desk. Justice is not what happens when the powerful fall. Justice is what gets built in the space they leave behind. She built it carefully with good accounts and honest hands, and a man beside her who had been waiting without knowing he was waiting to be part of something that was going to last. And it lasted. It lasted long past the summer that burned past the fever, and the 20 coins, and the Tuesday morning at the fence line, past the men on the ridge, and the broken files, and the letters to judges that nobody answered. Past all of it, into the long, clear future where the spring ran, and the mountains held their shape, and the land stayed with the people who had earned the right to love it. It lasted. That was enough. That was everything.